Section 25 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald OXLEY. Section 25. A Lumber Camp. There is no summer in a Canadian lumber camp. That is to say, there is nobody in the camp in summer, which amounts to the same thing. The season of activity in the camps, or the shanties as they are generally called, extends from late September to early April, and all summer long they are left to the care of birds that chirp and squirrels that chatter on the roof. In the month of September, the Canadian lumberman joins the gang of sturdy, active men who are bound for the shanties, where a winter of hard work awaits them. For him, the forest exists only to be remorselessly cut down. But though he may never stop to think about it, his is a very romantic and fascinating occupation. September is one of the loveliest months in the Canadian calendar. The days are still long and sunny. The heat of summer has passed away and the chill of autumn not yet come. One cloudless day follows another, and nature seems to be doing her best to make existence a delight. This is the time when the shantymen gather into gangs and by rail or steamer journey northward until they pass the limits of settlement. Then, taking to Shank's mare, they make their way into the depths of the forest. Let us follow a gang that is going upon a limit still untouched by the axe. Far up the Black River, a tributary of the Ottawa, 100 miles or more from the nearest village. This gang consists of about 40 men, including the foreman, clerk, carpenter, cook, and choreboy, all active, sturdy, and good-natured fellows. Most of them are French Canadians, habitants as the local term is, but English, Scotch, and Irish are found among them too, and often quite swarthy, wild-eyed men whose features tell plainly of Indian blood. Scouts have previously selected the best site for the camp. It is usually in the midst of the bunch of timber to be cut, so that little time may be lost in going and coming. On arriving, the first thing done by the gang is to build the shanty, which is to be its home during the long, cold winter. This edifice makes no pretense to architectural beauty, but nothing could be better adapted to its purpose. It is an illustration of simplicity and strength combined. With all hands helping heartily, a shanty 40 feet long by 28 feet wide can be put up in 5 days. Meantime, the builders live in tents. This is the way they go about it. First of all, a number of trees are cut down. The trunks, cleared of all their branches, are sawed into proper lengths, and then laid one upon another until an enclosure with walls 8 feet high is obtained. Upon the top of these walls strong girders are stretched, which are supported in the center by 4 great pillars called scoop bearers. Then comes the roof. A Canadian shanty roof is neither tiled nor shingled, but scooped. What is a scoop? It is a piece of timber, something like a very long railway tie, one side of which is hollowed out, trough-wise, clear to the ends. Place 2 of these side by side, with the concave sides upward. Then lay another on top of them, concave side down, so that the edges overlap and fall into the troughs, and you have a roof that will defy the heaviest rains or wildest snowstorms that Canada can produce. A floor of roughly flattened timbers having been laid, and a door cut, it only remains to construct the camboose, or fireplace, and the bunks, and the shanty is complete. Provided, of course, every cranny in the walls has been chinked with moss and mud, and a bank of earth thrown up all around the outside to make sure that no drafts can sneak in when the mercury is far below 0. The camboose is quite an important affair, and occupies the place of honor in the center of the room between the 4 massive scoop bearers. Its construction is as rude and simple as that of the rest of the shanty. A bank of sand about 2 feet deep and 6 feet square makes the hearth. Over it hang 2 wooden cranes that hold the capacious kettles, which are always full of the pea soup or fat salt pork that constitutes the chief items in the shantyman's bill of fare. A mighty fire roars and crackles unceasingly upon the hearth, its smoke escaping through a square hole in the roof, a hole so big that one may lie in the bunks and study the stars. This rude chimney secures the best of ventilation to the shantymen. The bunks, which are simply sloping platforms about 7 feet in length, running around 3 sides of the room, offer the sweet allurement of the soft side of a plank to the tired toilers at the close of the day. Such is a shanty of the good old-fashioned sort. In later days, such refinements of civilization as windows, stoves, and tables have been added by progressive lumbermen, but there are still scores of shanties to which the above description applies. The shantymen are now ready to begin operations against the great trees that have been standing all about, silent, unconscious spectators of the undertaking. The 40 men are divided according to the nature of their work. The clerk, cook, and chore boy are the home guard. The others, according to their various abilities, are choppers, road cutters, teamsters, sawyers, and chainers. The only duty requiring explanation is that of chore boy. It is usually performed by the youngest member of the gang, although sometimes it falls to the lot of a man well up in years. The chore boy is the cook's assistant and general utility worker of the shanty. He has to chop the firewood, draw the water, wash the dishes, and perform a multitude of such odd jobs, in return for which he is apt to get little thanks and much abuse. The choppers have the most important and interesting part of the work. They always work in pairs, and go out against the trees armed with a keen axe apiece and a cross-cut saw between them. Having selected their victim, say a splendid pine towering more than 100 feet in the air, they take up their position at each side. Soon the strokes of the axes ring out in quick succession. For some time the yellow chips fly fast, and presently a shiver runs through the tree's mighty frame. One of the choppers cries warningly to the other, who hastens to get out of the way. A few more strokes are given with nice skill. Then comes a rending crack, whose meaning cannot be mistaken, and the stately tree, after quivering a moment as though uncertain which way to fall, crashes headlong to the ground, making a wide swath through the smaller trees standing near. A good chopper can lay his tree almost exactly where he likes, and yet somehow accidents are of frequent occurrence. Every winter additions are made to the long list of men whom the trees have succeeded in involving in their own ruin. A gust of wind, the proximity of another tree, or some such influence may cause the falling trunk to swerve and fall with fatal force upon the unwary chopper. The tree felled, the next proceeding is to strip it of its branches, and saw it up into as many logs as can be got from it. 2, 3, 4, or even as many as 5 logs may be obtained from a single tree, the length of each being 13½ feet or 16½ according to the quality. The odd half foot is allowed for the brooming of the ends as the logs make their rough journey down the streams to the mills. 80 logs felled, trimmed, and sawed is quite an ordinary day's work for one pair of choppers, and when the choppers have been striving, that is, each pair trying its best to outdo the others, 600 logs have been turned in by a single pair as the splendid result of a week's work. The logs are at first piled up on rollways, which are simply 2 tree trunks placed a little distance apart. Later on, when the road makers have done their part, the teamsters bear them off to the bank of the stream, or out upon the ice of the lake, where they wait the coming of spring to begin their journey by water to the mills. The shantyman leads a free, hardy, healthy life. From dawn until dark he works in the open air, exercising lungs and muscles. When the autumn rains are over and the snow has come to stay, he breathes for 4 months the clear, cold, bracing air of the Canadian winter, fragrant with the scent of pine and cedar. No matter how fond of drink he may be, not one drop of liquor can he have, although he may and does drink long and deep from the cup that cheers. His fare possesses at least 2 sterling merits. It is substantial in quality and unlimited in quantity. He enjoys it most when the day's work is over, and no less weary than hungry, he trudges home to the shanty. There he finds the warm welcome of a steaming supper awaiting him. Drawn up about the blazing fire, he sees a pot of excellent pea soup, a boiler of strong tea, a big pan full of fat pork fried and floating in gravy, another pan containing slices of cold boiled pork, huge loaves of bread, baked in great iron pots buried deep in the ashes of the camboose, and better than city baker ever made, and a pile of bright tin basins. Picking up 2 of the basins, he fills one with soup and the other with tea. Helping himself to a generous slice of the hot bread, he makes use of it as a plate for a slice of the pork. Then he retires to the edge of his bunk, and with the aid of his clasp knife discusses this solid if not varied repast. There is not much change in the bill of fare all winter. Occasionally, perhaps, if the roads permit, fresh beef on foot will be sent up from the depot, and the lumbermen may enjoy the luxury of steaks and roasts. Quite often, too, a bit of game will fall in their way while they are working in the woods. Great is the rejoicing when Francois or Alec succeeds in bringing down a fat deer. Bear steak, too, is not unknown. The bear is trapped in a deadfall, or small hut above the door of which a heavy log is hung in such a way that it drops with crushing force upon the bear pushing in to get at the bait. Sometimes the shantymen do a little trapping on their own account. One of them, who wished to obtain a fine bearskin, paid dearly for his prize. He had set his steel spring trap, and returning after an interval, found that it had disappeared. The marks in the snow made tracking easy, and hurrying along he presently reached a great log over which the trap had evidently been dragged. His haste made him careless, and springing across the broad trunk without stopping to reconnoitre, he threw himself right into the arms of the bear. The animal, weary of dragging the heavy trap, was resting on the other side. The hunted creature was furious with pain. The shantyman's only weapon was his sheath knife, which he drew and stabbed the bear again and again in the breast. But stab as he might, he could not loose the brute's fatal grasp. Next day his comrades, anxiously following up his trail, found him dead, with the dead bear's paws still holding him fast. The shantyman's recess comes when the evening meal has been dispatched. He has an hour or more before bedtime. It is pipes all round, and song and joke and story win generous applause from the not overcritical audience. The French Canadians are especially fond of singing. They have many songs, some of which, like "À la Claire Fontaine" and "En roulant ma boule," are full of spirit and beauty. If François or Alec has remembered to bring his fiddle with him, and he seldom forgets it, the singing is sure to be followed by dancing as the evening goes on. Bedtime comes early in the shanty. By 9 o'clock at the latest, all have turned in. The process of going to bed consists simply in taking off one's coat and boots and rolling up snugly in a couple of thick blankets. Many a millionaire would gladly give one of his millions for the ability to sleep as soundly and restfully in his soft bed as does the shantyman upon his pine boards. In the dusk of early morning, the foreman's loud voice is heard calling to the men, "Turn out now and get your breakfast." The lumberman has been asleep 10 good hours, but he feels as if he has just laid down. Sunday is the day the shantyman likes best. No work is done upon that day. He can spend the time as he pleases. Generally, he is content to lounge about smoking and enjoying the luxury of doing nothing. A religious service is so rare a treat that when there is one, all attend it without reference to their creed. Thus the long winter slips by. The logs accumulate upon the river bank or out upon the icy lake. When the warm days of spring come, the lumberman's labors are at an end, so far as the shanty is concerned. The great spring drive begins. The logs start upon their journey southward, and the shantyman becomes a river driver. Armed with pike pole or camp hook, he hurries his awkward squads of logs downstream as a shepherd drives his flock to market. This is often a very exciting and dangerous occupation. The Canadian rivers abound in falls and rapids, past which the flocks of tree trunks have to be guided skillfully. Many a time the river driver's life is in peril as he wades through turbulent, ice-cold water, or leaps from rock to rock or from log to log in his efforts to prevent his charges from stranding. When the drive is finished, the shantyman's labors are over until the return of autumn recalls him to the forest. End of section 25. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
Section 26 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Scott, Cheltenham, England. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald OXLEY. Lacrosse. What the game of cricket is to England and the game of baseball to the United States is the game of lacrosse to Canada. And yet it is worth noting that both cricket and baseball flourish in Canada, which goes to show that the young Canadian seeks for quantity as well as quality in his sport. The Indians invented lacrosse, just as they invented the canoe, the snowshoe, and the toboggan, and it is not likely that their pale-faced brother will be able to invent something surpassing any of them. How long ago they invented lacrosse is a question not even Parkman nor Catlin can tell us. The Redskins have never had newspapers, and seem to have been poor hands at keeping diaries. Consequently, we can never hope to know when first the Iroquois' champion team, led by the famous chief Throw the Ball Half a Mile, defeated the Cree champions under the no less renowned Stop It With His Stomach Every Time. Kathleen, who saw it played by 600, 800, or even 1,000 Choctaws at a time, tells us that the players would trip and throw each other and sometimes take flying leaps over the heads of their stooping opponents, or dart between their extended legs. There are times, he adds, when the ball gets to the ground when there is a confused mass of sticks, shins, and bloody noses. I may add on my own account that those times are not altogether past and gone. Scratched shins and crimsoned noses are still to be found on the lacrosse field. There is, of course, a good deal of difference between lacrosse as played by the whites today and as it was played by the Redskins half a century ago. In the first place, the ground was not a level, smooth-shaven lawn with a cinder path around it, and beyond that rows of seats for spectators, but a glade in the forest, interspersed with stumps of trees, fallen trunks, and clumps of young spruce. The goals were single poles or stakes, about 8 feet high, and the distance between them varied in proportion to the number of players, from 500 yards to half a mile or even more. Then the cross was much shorter and smaller as to its netting, while among some tribes no netting at all was used, but instead thereof 2 sticks having spoon-shaped ends, between which the ball was caught and carried. As to the dress of the players, well, the difference is not so very great. The white men wear a little more on their backs, and canvas shoes instead of moccasins on their feet, and that is about the sum of the matter. I will now try to describe the game as it is played by the Canadian clubs today. The ground should be a smooth, level field 150 yards in length by 100 in breadth at the very least, and for championship matches another 50 yards each way is most desirable. The goals should be 125 yards apart, but a lesser distance may be agreed upon between the 2 captains if the nature of the ground requires it. The side boundaries are formed by the fence or ring of spectators, as the case may be. If the ball goes over the one, or gets tangled up with the other, it has to be brought out and faced. The nature of facing will be explained further on. The goals are simply 2 poles 6 feet high and 6 feet apart, and in front of them, at a lacrosse stick's length from their base, a line is marked with whitewash, inside of which no attacking player must enter unless the ball has preceded him. If he enters in advance of the ball, the goalkeeper may drive him out at the point of his stick and use any violence necessary for that purpose. The side consists of 12 players and a captain. The captain does not play, he simply runs round and shouts at the other fellows. It looks like an easy job, but it is far from being so. Upon the captain very often depends the fate of his team, and he should always be a cool, clear-headed, experienced player, thoroughly up to all the tricks and subtleties of the game. The lacrosse sticks, or crosses as they are called, are light, strong sticks made of either hickory, ash, or rock elm. The Indian preferring the first because of its strength, and the white man the other 2 because of their lightness. There is no rule as to the length of a stick, but practical experience has shown that the most convenient length is equal to the distance from the toe to the hollow under the arm. Each player can therefore suit himself in the matter. The netting is of gut and should be about 29 inches long and must not be more than 12 inches wide at its widest part. 9 inches is a good average width. There must be no bag to the netting, and to guard against this, the referee is required to inspect the crosses carefully before allowing the match to begin. The ball is of sponge India rubber, about half an inch less in circumference than a baseball, and weighing about 4 ounces. It should bounce freely, as this adds greatly to the uncertainty and interest of the game. All the preliminaries having been satisfactorily arranged, a fine day, a good ground, and a large gathering of spectators secured, we will suppose that a championship match between the representative teams of Montreal and Toronto is about to take place. At the appointed hour, The teams issue from their dressing rooms amid the cheers of their adherents and line up before the referee and umpires. That is, they face one another in 2 parallel lines, and then the referee proceeds to examine their crosses lest they should be bagged, and their shoes lest they may be spiked. He also addresses a word of warning to them upon the subject of rough play, which, unhappily, has become far too common of late. He then dismisses them, and they take up their places on the field. When this is done, they take their positions in pairs, each man having an opponent opposite him. Thus, the Montreal goalkeeper has the Toronto inside home just in front of him. Each of the fielders has a man to cover him, as the term is, and there is a Toronto centre as well as a Montreal centre. The game is begun by the 2 centre fielders. They half kneel opposite each other and lay their crosses on the ground face to face, every nerve and muscle tingling with excitement, for much may depend upon which gets the advantage at the start. This is called facing the ball, and when the referee is satisfied that everything is in readiness, he places a ball between the 2 crosses, taking care that it is exactly in the middle. At his shout of "Play!" the 2 centres strive, by a sharp sudden twist of the cross, each to draw the ball in his own direction. The successful one immediately passes it to the nearest fielder on his own side, who is instantly pounced upon by his cover, and then the fun begins in fierce earnest. It is quite out of the question to convey through the medium of print any adequate conception of the interest and excitement that a game of lacrosse between 2 well-matched teams affords. For brilliancy of individual effort, as well as of combined team play, for incessant movement and thrilling situations, for cheer-inspiring displays of undaunted pluck or untiring fleetness, there is no game that can compare with it. The ball flies all over the field, now soaring like a bird through the air, now skimming along the ground like a frightened field mouse. First one goal is in danger, and the players crowd so thickly about it that you cannot see the goalkeeper. Then a long throw from his skillful stick sends the rubber away off to the side, or perhaps almost down to the other goal, and 2 dangers are over for the time. Next, an artful dodger will catch the ball on his cross, and turning, twisting, dodging this way and that, dropping the ball when checked only to pick it up again deftly after the checker is eluded, will, amid the shouts and cries of spectators and players alike, carry it clear down the whole length of the field, and perhaps, if he be very lucky, send a grounder between the goalposts ere the goalkeeper has time to recover from the surprise of his onset. In the throwing, catching, checking, running, and dodging which the game calls for, every muscle and sinew is given fullest exercise, and every man in the team has a share of the work. There is no loafing possible in lacrosse, as there is in baseball and cricket, when the outfield are getting nothing to do. Even the goalkeeper has plenty of hard work, for whenever the ball goes behind the goalposts, he must go after it and struggle for it until he can send it either to one of his own side or far down the field. Indeed, the ability to play well behind the flags is as important a quality in a goalkeeper as an argus-eyed watchfulness over what is going on in front of him. While individual brilliancy, grandstand play as it is sometimes called, is all very well in its way, good team playing is far more effective in the end, and it is just because the whites excel in the latter that they have become more than a match for the Redskins, from whom they have adopted the game. One of the prettiest sights imaginable is to see 2 expert players tobying to one another for perhaps half the length of the field before they can be stopped. This tobying consists in their running along 10 or 15 yards apart and throwing the ball from one to the other so soon as there is danger of the one carrying it being checked. Another valuable accomplishment in a lacrosse player is knowing how and when to uncover, that is, to step away from the opponent who has been deputed to cover him, and consequently be free to snatch up the ball the moment it comes his way. When one team understands this better than the other, the result is to convey the impression that it must have more players, because there always seem to be 2 of them at least wherever the rubber is. The game is won by the ball being thrown between the goalposts, not higher than an imaginary line drawn across their tops. It must, of course, be thrown through from in front. Formerly, a match was decided by the winning of 3 games, best 3 out of 5. But in one of the 2 lacrosse associations now existing in Canada, a change has been made, and unless one team wins 3 games straight, play must be continued for 2 hours, and then the team having the most games wins the match. The reason of the change was that in some cases a team would take 3 games from their opponents in a few minutes, and at this the spectators grumbled. The most interesting recent event in the history of the game in Canada is the visit of the famous Toronto 12 to Great Britain. They are a splendid lot of players and seem to have it all their own way, as might be expected. The fact, however, that there are enough lacrosse clubs in the old country to make it worth their while to go over, proves that the game is making progress round the world. Indeed, it has been already heard of from Australia, India, China, and other faraway quarters of the globe. In the United States it is spreading rapidly, and the time cannot be far distant when we shall have international struggles for supremacy in lacrosse as well contested as we already have in some other sports. Some years ago, a team from the United States crossed the Atlantic to contend against their British cousins, and succeeded in winning every match they played but one. End of section 26.
Section 27 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendrie. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald OXLEY. Section 27. A Pillow Slip Full of Apples. A and HOAS. The Arch Room. 10 o'clock tonight. Bring a sheet and pillow slip. Abracadabra. Charlie Draper gazed at the piece of paper containing these simple words and mysterious signature with mingled feelings of pride and trepidation. Pride because it was the first time since his coming to Twin Elm Academy that he had been the recipient of one of these much prized missives, and trepidation because he had very vague notions of what his accepting the invitation it bore might entail. He was a new boy, just finishing his first month at the academy, and being of rather reserved disposition, had been slow in forming acquaintances. Indeed, but for an incident that suddenly brought him into prominence, he might have made still poorer progress in this direction than he did. A few days before this communication from Abracadabra, a party of the boys were bathing in the river near Deep Pool. A youngster, who could not swim, rashly ventured too near the pool, and disappeared in its dark depths. There arose an immediate chorus of cries from his companions, but no intelligent effort was being made at rescue, when Charlie Draper, who had not been of the party, came rushing up, threw off his cap and coat, plunged into the pool, and brought out the drowning boy at the first try. Of course he was a hero at once, and the leaders of the A and HOAS, the secret society of the academy, of which Charlie had already heard much, and admittance to which was the desire of his heart, lost no time in deciding that he was beyond question one of the right sort, and that he must become one of them forthwith. Hence the short but significant summons, whose contents have been already given. Promptly at 10 o'clock, Charlie, in his stocking feet, and provided with pillow slip and sheet, crept cautiously up the long stairs that led to the arch room. All the students, except those who belonged to the society, were already sound asleep, and the 2 tutors who lived in the building, knowing nothing of this exception, and imagining that every cot was duly occupied, had settled down for a comfortable smoke and chat in the cosy sitting-room of Mr. Butler, whose quarters were farthest away from the arch-room. Upon all this the members of the society had astutely reckoned, and the coast was accordingly clear for them to do as they pleased, as long as they did not make too much noise about it. Bearing his note of invitation as a passport, Charlie approached the door of the archroom. Suddenly, out of its shadow, a masked and draped figure darted, and putting its hand to his throat, inquired in a very husky voice, "What doest thou here?" For answer, Charlie held up his sheet and slip of paper. "'Tis well, pass on," said the husky mystery, and with palpitating heart Charlie tiptoed through the door. The moment he passed the portal, two other masked and draped figures seized him by either arm and hurried him before a fourth figure, who occupied a sort of throne at the far corner of the room. "Whom do you bring before me?" asked this potentate, in the husky tone which seemed to be characteristic of the society. "Charles Draper, may it please your sublimity," was the reply, accompanied by a reverent obeisance, in which Charlie was directed to join. "He hath been well recommended to us. Let him be put to the tests. If he doth survive them, and will take the oaths, he may be admitted into membership." Then followed a lot of the usual elaborate nonsense, such as boys delight to invent and execute in connection with their secret societies, and at the end of 15 minutes or so, Charlie, flushed and excited, but triumphant, was handed a gown and mask, and informed by the figure on the throne, whose official title was the same as the signature to the invitation, that he was duly admitted into the membership of the society, whose full name he now learned was the Ancient and Honourable Order of Apple Stealers. The next piece of information he received rather staggered him. It was that, according to the rules of the society, he must at once justify the confidence its members had reposed in him by proving his prowess as an apple stealer. The August pippins in Squire Ribston's orchard were reported to be ready to drop into one's mouth. Upon the novice, Charles Draper, devolved the perilous duty of securing a generous sample of those juicy golden globes, so that the Ancient and Honourable Order might pronounce judgment on their excellence. So soon as he understood this, Charlie began to wish he had not been in such a hurry to join the society. He had been at Twin Elm long enough to learn that old Squire Ribston's dogs were as good in their way as his apples were in theirs, and he did not at all relish the prospect of having an argument with them in their own territory at the dead of night. But he was too stout of heart to back out, or even to show any signs of flinching, as his sublimity proceeded to give him his instructions. Each member had brought a sheet with him. These were quickly converted into a rope, which reached from the window of the archroom to the ground. Stuffing the pillow slip into his pocket and putting on his shoes, Charlie, amid the whispered commands of his companions to "be sure and fill the pillow slip, don't call the dogs bad names, give the compliments of the order to the squire if you happen to meet him," and other inspiring injunctions, climbed carefully out of the window and let himself down, hand over hand, to the ground. Pausing only to kiss his hand circus fashion to the faces at the window, he hastened off noiselessly over the dew-laden grass in the direction of the squire's orchard. He knew his route well enough, and the distance was not quite half a mile, so that a few minutes' quick walking brought him to his destination. The Ribston mansion stood well back from the road, and the orchard lay to its rear. Charlie therefore thought it well to leave the road before he reached the gate, and to take a slant through the fields that brought him up to the orchard fence about 50 yards behind the house. Here he crouched down and listened with strained ears and throbbing pulses for the slightest sound that might indicate the proximity of a dog, but not a growl or bark or even sniff broke the clover-scented stillness. As it chanced, he had hit upon a particularly favourable night for his enterprise, the good squire being wont to spend his Friday evenings with admirable regularity at Dr. Aconite's, where the genial rector of St. David's and important Judge Surrebutter helped to make up a quartet that could play whist by the hour without so much as winking. For the sake of company on the way home, the squire always took his dogs with him, so that until his return, which was never later than 11 o'clock, the Ribston premises were entirely unguarded. Encouraged by the perfect silence, Charlie gently got over the fence, and, making his way to the august pippin tree, set diligently to work to fill his pillow-slip. The boughs were bending low beneath their weight of juicy fruit, and he had no need to shake them. There were far more apples within easy reach of his hand than he could carry home. 5 minutes sufficed to fill the pillow-slip, and then, with a vast sigh of relief, he crawled back over the fence, hastened across the field, and came to the fence beside the road. Knowing nothing of the squire's whist club, he took it for granted that all danger was practically over, and without looking to right or left, he tossed his bag over the fence and vaulted lightly after it. Hardly had his feet touched the ground than a sharp, suspicious bark came from only a few yards away, and the next moment a collie dog, followed closely by a fox terrier, bounded toward him, barking fiercely, while, looming dimly through the darkness, the portly form of their owner could be descried, as he demanded angrily, "Who are you, and what are you about?" Charlie could have answered both questions easily enough had he chosen to do so, but the time did not seem to him altogether favourable, and instead of a verbal reply, he picked up his pillow-slip, threw it over his shoulder, and took to his heels, with the dogs after him in full cry. "Catch him, Grip! Catch him, Oscar!" shouted the squire to his dogs, as he joined in the chase with all his might. Although hardly in condition for a sprinting match, Squire Ribston had been renowned for fleetness of foot in his younger days, and he showed a surprising turn of speed as he dashed down the road after the fleeing boy. Now, had Charlie dropped his heavy pillow-slip, he might have distanced his human pursuer easily, and as the dog seemed to be content with barking and to have no idea of biting, the irate squire would never have known more about the daring raider of his orchard than his strong suspicion that it was one of those rascally Twin Elm boys. But to let go his burden was the last thing Charlie thought of doing. To his daring, determined nature only two alternatives presented themselves: escape with his booty, or capture red-handed. So away he sped, holding tight to the pillow-case, the collie and terrier punctuating his strenuous strides with short, sharp barks. After his first furious spurt, the squire's speed rapidly slackened, until it became little more than a laboured jog-trot, and by the time he reached the entrance to the long avenue leading from the main road to the academy, Charlie was under the window, and jerking the sheet-rope by way of a signal to the boys to haul him up. Unfortunately, they were so occupied with some of their nonsense that they did not at first observe the signal, and precious moments were lost before they responded, so that Charlie's anxious ears caught the sound of the squire's panting as he toiled gamely along the avenue. "Hurry up, boys!" he called, as loudly as he dared. "The squire's after me!" The boys responded with a sudden jerk that snatched him off the ground and nearly made him drop the apples. Then up he went more steadily, foot by foot. But he was not half-way to the window when the squire, guided by his clever dogs, arrived upon the scene, and in spite of the semi-darkness, his keen old eyes took in the situation at a glance. "Aha! You young scoundrel! I have you now! Take that!" And he hurled his stout oak cane at the ascending boy. The result greatly exceeded his expectations, for the stick, going straight to its mark, gave Charlie such a stinging blow that he involuntarily let go of the weighty pillow-slip and dropped it down full upon the squire's pate, crushing his tall grey beaver over his eyes and sending him headlong to the ground. It was some moments before he could pick himself up again, and by that time Charlie was safe inside the window. Beside himself with wrath, the squire assailed the front door with furious blows, bringing both the tutors out in startled haste. To them, as well as his breathless, disordered condition permitted, he explained himself, and was at once invited to enter, while Mr. Butler went for Professor Rodwell. On the professor's arrival, all the boys were summoned to appear in the schoolroom, and presently in they flocked, all but the members of the A. and H.O.A.S. who, by the way, had managed to get into their nightgowns with marvellous celerity, manifesting their innocence by their unmistakably startled, sleepy faces. "Are all the boys here?" asked the squire suspiciously, on finding every one arrayed in his nightgown. Professor Rodwell counted heads carefully. "Yes, squire, all the boys are present," he replied. "Humph!" snapped the squire. "A clever trick, but they can't pull the wool over my eyes in that way." An anxious, expectant hush following, Professor Rodwell addressed the boys in grave, yet not unkindly tones. "Young gentlemen, it is clear beyond possibility of denial that some of you have been guilty of robbing Squire Ribston's orchard. Now, I dare say it will not be difficult to trace out the culprits, but I would much prefer that they should acknowledge their wrongdoing of their own accord. I therefore wait to give them the opportunity." There was but a moment's pause, and then Charlie Draper, stepping forward, said in a steady voice, looking full at Professor Rodwell, "It was I that took Squire Ribston's apples. Let me bear all the punishment." A look of mingled surprise and relief came into the professor's troubled face, and even the squire's anger-wrinkled countenance seemed to take on a softer expression, touched with approval of this frank avowal. "Charles Draper, I am very sorry," said Professor Rodwell slowly. "Although you've been but a short time with us, I had thought better things of you than this." Charlie's eyes fell, and his lip began to tremble. He was already feeling deep regret for his part in the matter, and these gentle words touched him to the heart. He was just about to express his contrition and ask for sentence upon himself, when the squire exclaimed, "Charlie Draper? Is that Charlie Draper?" "It is," replied Professor Rodwell, wondering why the squire asked. "The same boy that saved my little grandson Hughie from drowning in Deep Pool a week ago?" "Yes, squire, the same boy," replied the professor, now beginning to catch the old gentleman's drift. "Then," cried the squire, who was as quick of generous impulse as he was of temper, jumping from his seat and advancing toward Charlie, "I don't want this thing to go any further. Here's my hand, my brave lad. You're welcome to every apple on the tree, if you'll only come after them in honest, manly fashion, and not be playing such foolish pranks, skulking through the fields when you ought to be abed. Come now, Professor Rodwell, let's cry quits. I'm willing to let the matter rest. Boys will be boys, and if your boys will promise never to go out robbing orchards again, I'll promise to let 'em into my orchard on Saturday afternoons and take every apple they find in the grass, so long as the crop lasts." For a moment the boys were so bewildered by these astounding words that they could hardly credit their ears. Then a spontaneous cheer burst from their throats, and the upshot of the whole matter was that they heartily gave the promise the squire asked, and the professor, relieved beyond measure at the turn affairs had taken, dismissed them with the understanding that the night's doings should be no further inquired into, provided good behaviour was maintained in future. The pledge thus given, taking away from the A and HOAS its principal reason for existing under that name, did not, however, put an end to its career. It simply altered its title and amended its ways, and continued to flourish as vigorously as before, with Charlie Draper as one of its most popular and active members. End of section 27. Section 28 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendrie. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald OXLEY. Section 28. Lost on Lake St. Louis. The great river St. Lawrence, as if not content with its ordinary ample breadth, a few miles above the city of Montreal, spreads out into a wide sheet of water which is known as Lake St. Louis. Lake St. Louis is about 12 miles long by 8 in width at its widest part, and being famous for its cool breezes, the people from the city go out there in throngs every summer, so that its shores are well populated as long as the thermometer keeps well above the 70 point. In winter, however, it is very different. Then Jack Frost has a confirmed habit of sending the mercury away down, 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 not only below freezing point, but below zero even, and the blue waters of the lake turn into a floor as hard as steel, over which the snows drift and pile up and scatter again in fantastic windrows, until the warm spring sunshine melts them into soggy slush, and a little later rends the solid floor itself asunder, and sends it careering down the current in great jagged ice floes. There is nothing undecided about a Canadian winter. The Frost King means business from the start, and for 3 long months keeps a tight grip upon the land. Some winters, of course, he is more tyrannical than others. The Ross boys, for instance, thought that he had never before in their experience been so unmerciful as during the season that the event happened about which I am now going to tell. Day after day, for weeks at a time, the thermometer would not get up to the 0 mark at all, while it would at night drop as much as 30 points below it. "'Pon my word, this sort of weather isn't fair at all," said Bob Ross in an impatient tone at the breakfast table one morning. "A fellow can hardly stir out of doors without getting his nose or ears nipped. My nose was frostbitten for the 3rd time last night, and that's a little too much of a good thing for me." "Right you are, Bob," chimed in Phil, his elder brother, from across the table. "My poor ears have been nipped nobody knows how often. I expect one of them will drop off some fine day." "It's a keen winter, boys, no doubt," asserted Mr. Ross. "I don't remember many as sharp. But the longest winter has an end, and you'll forget all about the cold the first warm day that comes." "That may be, father," answered Bob, "but I'd like a little mild weather right now, if the weather clerk has no objections. You know we're going over to the church festival at Beauharnois tomorrow night, and an 8-mile tramp in this cold weather is not just what I'm hankering for, though I mean to go all the same." "My lad, when I was your age I would have thought nothing of double the distance, if only a certain person were at the end of it," replied Mr. Ross, with a meaning smile at his wife, as he added, "but perhaps you have no such attraction." "Not I," laughed Bob. "I'm going for the sake of the supper, but I won't answer for Phil," looking quizzically at his brother, who blushed violently and made a timely diversion by springing up and saying, "Come along, Bob, let us get at our work, cold or no cold." Whereupon the 2 lads went off together. Mr. Ross owned one of the largest and finest among the many farms that bordered upon Lake St. Louis. Although he was what might be called a gentleman farmer, he was a thoroughly practical farmer too. He made his farm pay him handsomely, and thought so well of his occupation that he had brought up his 2 boys to follow it also. When they were grown men, he would divide the greater part of his property between them, reserving only sufficient to keep himself and his wife in independent comfort during the remainder of their days. The 2 sons, Phil and Bob, at the time of my story about 16 and 14 years of age respectively, were as satisfactory a pair of boys as parents could wish. One, the elder, tall and dark, the other short and fair. Both were strong, healthy, hearty lads, full of spirit and fond enough of having their own way, but thoroughly sound at heart and passionately fond of father and mother. Although trained to all kinds of farm work, their education had not been by any means neglected. They had had a good share of schooling, and Mr. Ross never went into the city without bringing back a new book or the latest magazine, so that they might keep up with the spirit of the times. The church festival Bob spoke of was to take place the following evening at Beauharnois, a village that stood straight across the lake as the crow flies, a distance of about 8 miles. The snow was in capital condition for snowshoeing, and the two sturdy boys thought nothing of the tramp there and back. They would start from home at 4 in the afternoon, make Beauharnois about 6, enjoy themselves there to the best of their ability until 10, and then set off for home, where they ought to turn up soon after midnight. Much to their gratification, the cold next morning showed signs of moderating. "Looks as if the weather clerk was interested in the festival," remarked Phil in the course of the morning, his beaming face revealing clearly enough that others than the weather clerk were interested in the same event. "I'm glad it isn't quite so keen as yesterday," answered Bob. "A fellow will enjoy the spread all the better for not going to it with his nose frozen." "I shouldn't wonder if we had a regular change," said Mr. Ross, casting a searching glance at the sky, which was evidently losing its sharp blue tinge and becoming ashen grey in colour. "We often do have a soft spell about this time of the year. There'll most likely be snow soon. I hope it won't begin before you get home, boys." "Oh, I think not," replied Phil confidently. "It can't come much sooner than the morning." The hours of the day slipped quickly by, and sharp at 4 o'clock the two boys set forth on their long tramp. They certainly were a prepossessing pair in their white blanket coats that became them so well, tied with broad scarlet sashes and blue caps with scarlet tassels on their heads. Bidding good-bye to their parents, who stood at the door watching them with fond pride, Phil and Bob strode swiftly down the slope to the lake, and soon were tramping over its broad bosom, upon which the snow lay deep in undulating waves. Barring the leaden hue of the sky, the afternoon could hardly have been finer. The stinging cold was gone, yet the air was keen enough to be bracing. There was little or no wind. The snow was well packed, and, full of joyful expectations, the brothers walked on side by side, their broad snowshoes bearing them easily upon the very surface of the drifts. 8 miles in 2 hours was no remarkable performance for two such expert snowshoers as they, and they accomplished it without difficulty, reaching their destination just as the bell in the tower of the church boomed out 6 solemn strokes. Leaving their coats and snowshoes at a friend's house, they hastened to the place where the festival was in full swing, and entered heartily into the enjoyments, each following his own bent. The expectations of both were fully satisfied. The supper presented more dainties on its generous bill of fare than even the capacious appetite of Bob could comfortably sample, and Phil was not disappointed in the light that shone from a certain pair of brown eyes, that for some mysterious reason had more attraction for him than anything else the entertainment offered. 10 o'clock came all too soon for him, especially as the festival was not entirely over, although some of those who lived at a distance had already left. But Bob was rather glad, as the last hour had been somewhat slow from his point of view. So siding up to Phil, he whispered discreetly in his ear, "Time to go, Phil. It's most 10 o'clock." Phil pulled out his watch with an incredulous look, but alas, it told the same story as Bob, and dearly as he would have liked to linger, he knew well enough that the sooner they started now the better. So with a very regretful adieu to the one whose presence had made the assembly shine, he joined his brother at the door. When they got outside, the look of the night and the feel of the air told them that the snow was nearer at hand than they had expected. In fact, a few soft, sly flakes were already dropping noiselessly. The friend at whose house they had left their coats and snowshoes suggested their staying all night. But although Bob was nothing loath, Phil would not be persuaded. "Father said he'd wait up for us," he objected, "and he'll get anxious if we're not home by 12 o'clock. Come along, Bob." Accordingly, off they went into the darkness of the night. When they reached the shore of the lake, they could just see the glimmer of the village lights by which they were to be guided, their home lying about half a mile to the left. Although their pace was far from a loitering one, they did not get over the snow by any means so fast as in the afternoon. Bob was not only tired and sleepy, but provoked with Phil, for refusing to stay all night at their friend's house. Indeed, he hoped his brother would yet repent and return, and so his feet dragged not a little. Noticing this, Phil said briskly, "Step out, Bob. We'll have all we can do to get across before the snow comes." "All well enough to say step out," answered Bob gruffly. "Why couldn't you stay overnight? I'm too tired to walk fast anyhow, snow or no snow." "Oh, you're not tired, Bob. You've eaten a little too much supper, that's all," rejoined Phil pleasantly. Bob vouchsafed no answer, and for some time the brothers tramped along in silence. As they neared the centre of the lake, the snowflakes, which had at first been few and far between, thickened rapidly, and the wind at the same time rose into gusts that blew them sharply into the boys' faces. A thrill of alarm shot through Phil, and grasping Bob's arm he called out, "It looks nasty, Bob. Let's put on a spurt." At this appeal Bob roused himself, and quickening their paces to a trot, they hastened onward, their snowshoes rising and falling in steady unbroken step. Every minute the snow and wind increased, until at length the storm in full force burst upon the boys, and almost blew them off their feet. All around them the air was filled with flakes of white whirling about in bewildering myriads, splashing like fine spray into their faces, and stinging like small shot, for the wind was bitterly cold. Presently Phil halted, and, peering hard into the blinding storm, cried anxiously, "What's become of the lights, Bob? I can't see them a bit. Can you?" "No," panted Bob. "Let's turn back." "No use in that," replied Phil, turning round. "I can't see those behind us either. There's nothing for it but to push ahead." "Oh, Phil, are we lost?" asked Bob, with quivering lips. Phil was more than half afraid they were, but to reassure Bob he answered cheerfully, "It's all right. I know how to steer. Come along." And grasping Bob's hand, he started off again. On and on they plodded through storm and snow, Phil half dragging Bob, who, between fright and real weariness, found difficulty in making progress at all. For half an hour more they struggled thus, until at last Bob dropped his brother's hand and flung himself down in the snow, sobbing out despairingly, "It's no use, Phil. I'm dead beat. You'll have to go on without me." "Nonsense, Bob," said Phil, taking him by the shoulder. "Jump up and go at it again." Thus helped to his feet, Bob made another attempt, but had not gone more than a quarter of a mile in a way that was staggering rather than walking, before down he slipped again, and this time all that Phil could do failed to rouse him from his stupor. The cold and exhaustion had completely overcome him. He had but one thought, and that was to be allowed to sleep. Phil fully realized the danger, and, tired as he was himself, put forth every exertion to keep his brother awake. He even tried to drag him along by his sash in what he thought was the right direction, but of course soon found this impossible. Desert his brother he would not, though they died together. So, in order to keep himself from falling into the same state, he made a circle around him, walking slowly. While doing this he encountered a high drift, whose lee afforded some shelter from the blast. An idea flashed into his mind, which he instantly proceeded to execute. Returning to Bob, he dragged him with infinite difficulty to this spot. Then, slipping off one of his snowshoes, he proceeded to cover his body with snow, leaving nothing but his head exposed. The poor boy, now fast asleep, offering no objection to such strange bedclothes. Then, sitting down beside him, with the big drift protecting his back, he let the snow gather over himself, hoping he hardly knew for what, and praying for the Lord who sent the snowstorm to have mercy on them both. In a vague way, for the stupor was fast creeping upon him too, he wondered if his father had begun to miss them yet, and whether he would come out in search of them. He even dimly pictured his father sitting in the parlour at home reading his book, and pausing every now and then to listen for his boys' voices. His mother, he knew, would have gone to bed long ago. He felt relieved that the snow no longer stung his face, and that the wind had gone down completely, and so his thoughts wandered on until he knew no more. 1 hour, 2 hours passed, and the drifting snow had hidden the forms of the two boys from sight, when a long line of men might have been seen coming from the village and scanning carefully every mound and swell of the snow as they hastened onward. In advance of the rest strode Mr. Ross, his face full of grave anxiety, his eyes intent upon the white plain before him that seemed to have so little to tell. Now bounding on ahead, and now returning to look up in his face with inquiring eyes, was his wise old collie, Oscar, without whom he never went abroad. "Find them, Oscar, find them, good dog," would Mr. Ross say encouragingly, and the sagacious animal would dart on again. Presently he stopped beside a drift, now grown to huge proportions, sniffed sharply at the snow, and then proceeded to dig into it with eager, vigorous paws. Observing his action, Mr. Ross uttered a cry of joy and sprang forward to the dog's side. Going down on his knees, he tore at the snowbank in a frenzy of haste. In another moment a red tassel appeared, then a blue cap, then a white, still face, and, others coming to his aid, the forms of the two boys were exposed to view, Phil still sitting up with his head bent over his knees, and Bob lying comfortably beside him. That they were both alive was clear enough, for they were breathing, very faintly to be sure, but undoubtedly breathing. Mr. Ross caught up one after another in a passionate embrace. Then litters were quickly improvised out of blanket coats stripped from willing backs, and soon the unconscious boys were speeding homeward as fast as stalwart arms could bear them. The rest of the story is quickly told. Thanks to the sturdy frames and perfect constitutions, the brothers were only temporarily the worse for their experience. They both were frostbitten, of course, Bob's poor nose and Phil's feet coming in for the worst of it, but a few weeks' good nursing cured everything, and no scars remained to remind them, had they ever been likely to forget it, of the night they were lost. End of section 28. Section 29 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendrie. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald OXLEY. Ice skating in Canada. It is a glorious winter afternoon, and having left the smoke and din and dust of the city far behind, we are standing together at the foot of the first of the Dartmouth Lakes. Straight before us, and spreading far out on either hand, lies a glistening expanse, whose polished surface flashes back the cheerful sunshine. 3 unbroken miles in length, and more than 1 in width, this icy plain awaits us in its virgin purity. It were strange, then, did not our fingers tremble with impatience, and our acmes snap with feverish haste. They are on at last, and now for the supremest luxury of motion. The crisp, cool air is charged with electricity. Every answering nerve tingles delightfully, and the blood leaps responsively through the throbbing pulses. Once out upon the ringing ice, and we seem to have passed from the realm of solid flesh and blood to that of tricksy, dainty Ariel. We have broken loose from the bonds of gravitation, and as with favouring wind we speed away to the farther shore, every stroke of our steel-shod feet counting good for a quartet of yards, the toiling and moiling of the workaday world seem to have found at the margin of the lake a magic barrier, beyond which they may not follow us, and with spirits light and free we glide off into a new sphere where care and labour are unknown. Mile after mile flashes past, yet our muscles weary not, nor does the breath grow short. But what is this? Is our flight already ended, and must we turn back so soon? The fir-clad shores, which were a little while ago so far apart, have drawn together until they seem to meet not far ahead, and put a bar to further progress. A cunning turn, a short, quick dash over the dangerous spot where the current runs swiftly and the ice bends ominously, and behold, we are out again upon a second lake, still larger than the first, and dotted here and there with tiny evergreen islets that look like emeralds in a silver setting. For 3 miles more our way lies before us smooth and clear, and then at last, as having reached the limit of our enterprise, we throw ourselves upon a fallen tree to rest our now tired limbs and catch our diminished breath, I ask which of wheelman, horseman, yachtsman, sculler, or skater enjoys the finest exercise. No country in the world presents better facilities for indulgence in the luxury of skating than Canada. Holland may with propriety boast of her smooth canals, Norway of her romantic fjords, Scotland for her poetic lochs. But for variety of lake, river, canal, pond, and frozen sea, from the majestic St. Lawrence to the humblest stream that affords delight to the village red-cheeked lads and lasses, Canada is unsurpassed. It is no wonder, then, that the Canadians are a nation of skaters, and that the skating rinks should be as indispensable an adjunct to every city, town, and village as the church and the concert hall. With a season extending over 4 and often 5 months, the managers of rinks can count upon receiving profitable returns upon their capital, and so those institutions multiply. Owing to the great quantity of snow which every winter brings, the season for outdoor skating in Canada is very short, consisting usually of the middle weeks of December, when Jack Frost, by thoughtfully anticipating the snow, allows of a fortnight skating in the open air before the mantle of winter hides his handiwork from sight and use. As a natural consequence, Canadians are not remarkable for long-distance skating, and 2 winters ago the swiftest flyers of our land had to lower their banner before Mr. Axel Paulsen, the renowned Norwegian skater, who made a triumphant tour through Canada and the United States. On the other hand, the long season enjoyed by the rinks enables all who will take the trouble, and do not shrink from a novitiate of bumps and bruises, to become exceedingly expert at fancy skating, and it is hardly debatable that the rinks of Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, and St. John can send forth skaters who, for grace, precision, and intricacy of movement, would find no superiors in the world. When Mr. Paulsen attempted to teach the Canadians fancy skating, he was somewhat chagrined to find himself soon reduced to the position of learner. As an ice acrobat, he did indeed perform 1 or 2 feats that were novel, but they had only to be seen to be immediately copied, while some of the Canadians were able to open his eyes to possibilities of didos, which he thought it not best to hurriedly attempt. His visit was of permanent value, however, because it awakened a deeper interest in long-distance skating, and one may safely venture to prophesy that, should Mr. Paulsen come this way again, he will find the defeat of his whilom opponents at long distances not quite such a holiday task as on the occasion of his last visit. What is known in England as figure skating, and there very ardently indulged in by well-to-do members of the various clubs who can afford to acquire the art in Norway or Scotland, is but little practised in Canada. It is not suitable for rinks, as it requires so much room, and can only be done to advantage in large open spaces, which the figurists may have all to themselves. Figure skating is undoubtedly very effective and striking when executed by a band of well-disciplined skaters who thoroughly understand one another. but it is so elaborate and takes so much time both in preparation and performance that it is not suited to the latitude of a colony where the majority of those who skate have no surplus leisure and want to make the most of the time at their disposal for recreation. There is one phase of figure skating, however, which does flourish throughout Canada, to wit, dancing, and it would delight the heart of Terpsichore herself to watch a well-skilled quartet of couples gliding through the mazes of the lancers or quadrille, or sweeping around in airy circles to the music of the waltz. The evolutions differ somewhat, of course, from the steps taken on the floor, but the identity of the dance is far from being lost, and the pleasure of the dancer is greatly enhanced through the surpassing ease of motion. This dancing on the ice may be seen in its perfection at Halifax, the capital of Nova Scotia, which, being a garrison city, enjoys the unique privilege of military bands, and the officers as a rule becoming enthusiastic skaters, the ladies who grace the fashionable Rink by their presence have a grand time of it, gliding entrancingly about to the bewitching strains of delightful music, and bringing all the artillery of their thrilling eyes, tempting cheeks, and enslaving lips to bear upon the gallant sons of Mars, who oftentimes find the slippery floor more fatal than the tented field. The finest rinks in Canada are those in Montreal, Halifax, and St. John. The rink at Halifax is really the Crystal Palace of the exhibition grounds, and for size, appearance, and convenience is surpassed by none. One of the most cheerful sights imaginable is this vast building on band night, when the snow-white arena is almost hidden beneath a throng of happy skaters, youths and maidens, circling round hand in hand, the maiden glowing with pride at her admirer's dexterity, the youth enraptured by his charmer's roseate winsomeness. Here doth Cupid bid defiance to the chilling blasts of winter, and although the poets and painters have conspired to confine him to a garb appropriate to the dog days, the sly wielder of the fatal bow must in winter enwrap himself in furry garments, and like a tiny Santa Claus perch his chubby form unseen among the rafters, and from that coign of vantage let fly his shafts thick and fast into the merry company beneath. One of the chief attractions of skating for the ambitious disciple is that there is practically no limit to its possibilities in the way of invention and combination. It would be extremely difficult to prepare for any skating tournament a hard and fast programme which would meet every requirement. Hence, in competitions of this kind, the custom is to lay down some 20 or 30 of the best-known feats which every competitor is supposed to do, and then leave each contestant to superadd thereto such marvels of skill as he may have picked up or invented. At the same time, of course, there may be almost as many degrees of skill represented in the execution of the set programme as there are competitors, and the judges must take this fully into consideration when making their award, and not allow their judgment to be dazzled by some particularly striking extra. Skating tournaments, however, are not as frequent as they ought to be. While every other recognised sport has its regularly recurring trials of proficiency, skating has hitherto been inexplicably neglected. Surely nothing could be more interesting or attractive than a gathering of accomplished skaters of both sexes, vying with one another in the ease and grace with which they can illustrate the intricacies of the grapevine, the difficulty of the giant swing, or the rapidity of the locomotive. Trials of speed are common enough at all rinks, and are undoubtedly more popular and exciting than trials of skill, but the more refined and less demoralizing competition should not be entirely neglected. The speed attained by those who race in rinks, it need hardly be explained, affords no criterion whatever whereby to judge of what fast skaters are competent to accomplish. The incessant turns, the sharp corners, the confined area, all tend to materially reduce the rate of progression, and only out on some broad lake or long extending reach of river can the skater do his best. I have no records at hand as I write, but my own experience justifies me in venturing the assertion that a champion skater in perfect form, and properly equipped with long-bladed racing skates, would prove no mean antagonist for Maud S. herself over a measured mile, while at longer distances he would have the field to himself. Like all other amusements, skating in Canada waxes and wanes in popular estimation, according to the mysterious laws of human impulse. One winter, skating will be voted not the thing, and the rinks will be deserted. The next they will be crowded, and even the heads of families will be fishing out their rusty acmes from the lumber closet, and renewing their youth in the icy arena. As a means of exercise during the long weary months of winter, when the deep snow renders walking a toil devoid of pleasure, and the muscles are aching for employment, the skating rink is an unspeakable boon, especially to him whose lot it is to endure much dry drudgery at the desk's dead wood. An hour's brisk spinning around will clear the befogged brain, brace up the lax frame, and give a keenness to the appetite that nothing else could do. Then the rink has its social as well as its sanitary advantages. During the winter months it affords both sexes a pleasant and convenient rendezvous, where, unhampered by the conventionalities of the ballroom, and aided by the cheerful inspiration of the exercise, they can enjoy one another's society with a frequency otherwise unattainable. On band days, indeed, the rink becomes converted into a spacious salle d'assemblée, where the numbered programme of musical selections enables Corydon to make engagements in advance with Phyllis, and thus ensure the prosperous prosecution of his suit. A carnival on ice, and every rink has one or more during the season, affords a rarely interesting and brilliant spectacle. For these occasions the building dons its gala dress, the gaunt rafters are hung with banners, the walls are hidden beneath variegated bunting and festooned with spruce embroidery. Lights gleam brightly from every nook and corner, and the ice is prepared with special care. Then, as the motley crowd glides swiftly by, one may behold representatives of every clime and nation mingling together in perfect amity. It is true, the tawny Spaniard, the dark-eyed Italian, the impassive Turk, the appalling Zulu, the soft and silent Hindu, and others whose home lies beneath the southern skies, betray a familiarity with the ice which seems to cast some doubt upon its genuineness. But when his satanic majesty himself, with barbed tail and cloven hoof, confesses to an intimacy with the mazy evolutions of the Philadelphia grapevine, the incongruity attaching to visitors from cooler climes appears less striking, and they may go on their way unchallenged. Sometimes masks are de rigueur at these carnivals, and then the inevitable clown and harlequin have unlimited license, till even Quakers and friars, infected by their bad example, vie with them in mad pranks, and the fun soon waxes furious. Masked or unmasked, the carnival skaters have a joyous time, and the hours steal away with cruel haste. Such are some of the phases of ice skating in Canada. If this article has seemed to be devoted principally to indoor skating, it is because that can be pursued through so much greater a portion of the winter than the outdoor kind. Skating in its perfection is of course only to be had in the open air, and my most delightful recollections are associated with the Dartmouth lakes, of happy memory. Connected with the same lakes, however, there is a recollection too thrilling to be delightful, and which, in view of what might have been, brings a shudder even now, while I rehearse it. It happened in my college days. I had been skating all the afternoon, and as the dusk grew on apace, found myself away down at the head of the second lake, full 6 miles from the point where I had got on the ice. So girding up my loins, I set my face towards home, and struck out lustily. After going about 100 yards, I thought I heard the sound of my name come faintly to me over the ice. Wheeling sharply about, I saw nothing except a dark form some distance away, which through the gathering gloom resembled a log or tree branch, and I was just about to start off again, when once more my name was called, this time so clearly as to leave no chance for doubt, the sound evidently coming from the seeming log. Hastening over to it with all speed, I was startled to find the professor of classics at my college, who did not allow the loss of an arm to debar him from the pleasure of skating, lying on the ice with his left leg broken sharp and clear a few inches above the ankle, the result of a sudden and heavy fall. Here indeed was a trying situation for a mere lad to cope with. We were alone in a wilderness of ice, and 6 miles away from the nearest house. The shadows of night were fast closing around us. Those 6 miles had to be gotten over in some way, and there was not a moment to be lost. Hurrying to the shore, I cut down a small spruce tree. Upon this the helpless sufferer was laid as gently as possible, and bound to it with straps. Then upon this rude ambulance I slowly dragged him down the lake, while he, with splendid self-control, instead of murmuring at his terrible agony, charmed away my weariness by his unconquerable heroism. It was a toilsome task, but help came when we reached the first lake, and once the shore was gained, a long express wagon filled with mattresses made the homeward journey comparatively painless. All is well that ends well. The broken leg soon mended, and the following winter found the professor skating as briskly as ever. Yet I cannot help wondering sometimes with a shudder how it would have fared with the interpreter of Greece and Rome, had not that first faint call reached my ears. A bitter cold night, a wide expanse of polished ice, a solitary man lying prone upon it with one arm missing at the shoulder, and one leg broken at the ankle. It were little less than a miracle if ice skating in Canada had not been clouded by one more catastrophe that winter night. End of section 29.
Section 30 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald OXLEY. Section 70. The Wild Dogs of Athabasca. Old Donald Matavish was a wonderfully interesting character. In the service of the Hudson Bay Company, which for nearly 200 years held regal sway over the vast unknown northwest of Canada, he had spent half a century of arduous and exciting service, living far away from civilization, one of a mere handful of white men in the midst of a wilderness sparsely inhabited by the Indian and the half-breed, but abounding in deer, buffaloes, bears, wolves, and the smaller animals. He had risen rapidly in the service, for he was a fearless, staunch, trustworthy man, and for the latter half of 2 terms had filled the important post of chief factor at different forts, for it was his somewhat undesirable, if honorable, lot to be sent to those stations that gave the most trouble and the least returns to the company. Such was his reputation for shrewdness, courage, and fidelity, that it was felt by the authorities that no other man could so soon set matters straight as Donald Matavish. Having filled out his 50 years with entire satisfaction to his employers and no small credit to himself, he had retired on his laurels to spend a hale and hearty old age in the enjoyment of the comfortable pension awarded him by the company which he had served so well. It was the delight of his declining days to recount for the benefit of younger ears the many thrilling incidents of his adventurous career, and one of his favorite stories was that which I shall now attempt to tell as nearly as possible in his own words. It was early in the 50s when I had charge of old Fort Assiniboine, away out on the Athabasca River, not far from the Rockies. Sir George Simpson, the governor of the colony at Red River, like the thoughtful man he was, had sent out to me by the Spring Brigade a splendid Scotch stag hound, one of half a dozen he had just brought with him from the dear old land. Oh, man, but he was a dog! His back was on a level with my belt, and when he raised himself on his hind legs, he could put his forepaws on my shoulders and rub noses with me. Yet I stood a good 6 feet in my stockings in those days. His hair was as grizzled as old Ephraim's, and coarse, and curled like what they stuff beds with. His body was long and lean, and so was his head, but he had a noble eye, and then the way he could run and leap over everything that came in his path. It was a sight to see, I warrant you. We soon got very much attached to each other, and wherever I went, Bruce went too. He did not seem to take to anyone else, and I was just as well pleased that he did not, for I never wanted him out of my sight. That same summer a new hand was sent to the fort. He was an Englishman, who gave his name as Heathcote, and he brought with him a pure white female bulldog that was one of the most dangerous-looking brutes I ever laid eyes on. She minded nobody but her master, of whom, to do her credit, she seemed fond enough. I never much cared for that breed of dog, but I must say Vixen was about perfect in her way. As to good breeding, there certainly wasn't much to choose between her and Bruce. I was a little uneasy as to how the two dogs would get on, and at first it did look as if there might be trouble, for Bruce, who utterly despised the rabble of curs hanging about the fort, evidently felt disposed to resent the coming of this possible rival. But almost before I knew it, the two were the best of friends, and would eat their dinner side by side like two well-behaved children. After a while, they took to going out a-hunting together, and grand times they had. They would work along in company until a herd of deer was started, and then Bruce would make for the fattest doe, his tremendous speed soon bringing him to her throat, while Vixen, following at her best rate, would come up just in time to help him finish her. And then they would have a fine feast. Once the dogs got into these ways, neither Heathcote nor I had much more satisfaction out of them. They were never on hand when wanted. They kept growing wilder and wilder, and finally, toward autumn, they disappeared one day and were never seen at the fort again. We hunted for them high and low, sending out the half-breeds as far as Lake Lacrosse on the east, and to the foothills of the Rockies on the west, but not a sign or trace could we find of them. When winter came and they did not return, we gave them up as lost, thinking that something must have happened to them on one of their hunting forays, or that perchance they had been killed by the Indians. 2 years went by, and Bruce and Vixen were almost forgotten, when stories began to reach the fort of a strange and fierce kind of wild dog that was being seen now and then by hunters and trappers in the out-of-the-way valleys and ravines of the foothills. It was not an easy job to get at the bottom of these stories, for they passed from mouth to mouth before reaching us. But at last a trapper turned up who had seen a pack of the dogs himself, and after hearing his description, I had no longer any doubt but that these wild dogs, which were making such a stir, were the offspring of our 2 former pets who had gone away in company. By all accounts, they were evidently dangerous brutes to meet. From Bruce they had got wonderful speed and endurance. From Vixen, ferocity and fearlessness. Swift, savage, stubborn, and always going in large packs, there was not an animal on the plains or up among the mountains for which they were not more than a match. I felt eager to get a sight of the creatures, even though it should mean some risk, for while, like all wild dogs, willing enough to give men a wide berth, there was no telling what they might do if pressed by hunger. It was therefore good news when, a year later, orders came from Red River for me to make a trip to Fort George on the other side of the Rockies, where there were some matters that needed straightening up, as either going or coming back I would run a good chance of seeing something of the famous dogs. I left Fort Assiniboine in the autumn, and although a sharp lookout was kept by all the party as we went over to Fort George, not a sight nor sign of the dogs did we stumble upon. But on my way back in the spring I had better luck, and I certainly shall never forget my first and last sight of those terrible brutes. We had crossed the Rockies and were descending the eastern slopes, getting down among the foothills. One day Heathcote and I pushed on together in advance of the rest, both of us having the dogs on our mind. Early in the afternoon we came to a bluff that overlooked a lovely little valley, which we at once decided would be our camping place for the night. A bright stream ran along the center of the valley. Having thought that perhaps a herd of deer might put in an appearance if we kept out of sight, we stretched ourselves out comfortably on the bluff and awaited developments. They proved to be interesting beyond all our expectations. We had been there about an hour, perhaps, when Heathcote, who had been looking over at the opposite bluff, suddenly grasped my arm, saying under his breath, "Look there, McTavish! What do you think of that?" A break in the bluff had made a sort of easy descent into the valley, and down this were coming, in single file, 1, 2, 3, 4, no less than a dozen bears of the large and dreaded silver-tip kind. Splendid fellows, most of them, bent on having a good time on the sunny slopes beside the stream. We hardly dared to stir or breathe. To have attacked them would have been utter madness. Thankful might we be if we could crawl away without their attacking us. While lying there motionless and wishing to the bottom of our hearts that the rest of the party were on hand to make matters even, a fierce bark came from the bluff a little above where the bears first showed themselves. It was followed by a whole chorus of deep-mouthed baying, and an instant later there rushed into view, fairly tumbling over one another in their impetuous haste, a great pack of dogs that we at once recognized as those we wished to see. They were certainly a fearsome lot of creatures. Some were long, lean, and shaggy, like Bruce. Others were thick-bodied and smooth of hair, like Vixen. And all were powerful, ravenous-looking brutes, a dozen of whom might eat a good-sized buffalo for dinner without feeling uncomfortably overloaded after their meal. They sighted the bears the moment they reached the edge of the bluff, and at once rushed down to the attack, barking as though they would split their throats. The bears made ready to receive them by massing together at the top of a little knoll near the water, and before we could fully realize what was taking place, the fight had begun. So far as we could make out, the dogs numbered 50 at least, so that, considering their size and strength, the odds were a good deal in their favor. But the bears fought like heroes. At first they crowded together in a sort of circle, with heads facing out, while the dogs ran round them, snarling and barking, and watching their chance to spring. A few moments later the circle was broken up into a dozen roaring, writhing, yelping groups, composed of a bear with 4 or 5 of the dogs clinging tenaciously to different parts of its body. It was the Vixen strain that told now. Again and again would the bear, rising on its hind quarters, hurl the dogs from him with mighty sweeps of his huge forepaws, only to be penned at once and brought to the ground by a fresh attack. At frequent intervals an agonizing death howl would pierce its way through the horrible clamor, as some unfortunate dog, caught in the grasp of its maddened enemy, would be crushed to death in its resistless embrace. The minutes slipped by, and the fight still raged, but there could be no doubt how it would result. The dogs had the best of it as to numbers, and they were the equals of the bears in courage, ferocity, and endurance, if not in sheer strength. One by one the big brown bodies rolled over in the stillness of death. At the end of about half an hour the fight was over. Not a bear breathed, and around their torn carcasses lay between 20 and 30 of the dogs, as dead as themselves, the best possible proof of how fiercely and obstinately they had fought. Not a word had passed between Heathcote and myself while all this went on. We were too much taken up with the extraordinary conflict going on before our eyes, even to look at each other. But when it was all over, and the surviving dogs, having satisfied themselves that the bears were really all dead, lay down to lick their many wounds, before they began upon the feast their brave victims had provided for them, I touched Heathcote on the shoulder and whispered, "We've seen the dogs. Let's take good care they don't see us. After such a proof of their powers as we had had, we were in no mind to claim a near acquaintance with them on the score of having once owned their ancestors. Accordingly, we crawled noiselessly away, and making a long circuit, rejoined our party in time to prevent their turning down into the valley, which we no longer considered a good place to camp in for the night. That was my first and last sight of the wild dogs of Athabasca. The following autumn I went east, and never returned to Fort Assiniboine. Whether the dogs have since been all killed off, or are still running wild among the far recesses of the Rockies, I don't know. But that wonderful battle in the valley was one of the greatest sights of my life, and like of which no one perhaps will ever again see on this continent. End of section 30. The Wild Dogs of Athabasca.
Section 31 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald OXLEY. Birds and Beasts on Sable Island. If you will take your atlas and turn to the map of Canada, you may, by looking very carefully, discover a small spot in the Atlantic Ocean almost due east from Nova Scotia, and close beside the 60th parallel of longitude. This little lonely spot is Sable Island. There it lies in the midst of the waves, a long, low bank of grey sand without a single tree upon it from end to end. Nay, not so much as a bush behind which a baby might play hide and seek. It seems, therefore, at first sight to be one of the most unfavourable places in the world for the study of either birds or beasts. Yet, strange as it may seem, this island, which is now but 20 miles long, and at its greatest breadth but a mile and a half wide, once it was quite double that size, has a wonderfully interesting history of its own, of which not the least entertaining chapter is that relating to its furry and feathered inhabitants. Although when first viewed from the sea Sable Island appears to be nothing better than a barren sandbank, on closer acquaintance it reveals inside its sloping beaches, vales, and meadows that in summer time seem like bits out of a western prairie. There are green, grassy knolls, and enchanting dells with placid ponds in their midst, and if you only come at the right time and stay long enough, you may gather pink roses, blue lilies, china asters, wild pea, gay goldenrod, and, what is still better, strawberries, blueberries, and cranberries in bountiful profusion. Our concern at present, however, is not with the fruits and flowers, but with the fur and feather of this curious place. Seeing that Sable Island has no trees on the branches of which nests may be built, it follows naturally that its winged inhabitants are altogether of the waterfowl and sea-bird variety. All over the sides and tops of the sand hills, which rise to the height of 30, 40, or 50 feet, the gulls, gannets, terns, and other aquatic birds scrape together their miserable apologies for nests, and hatch out their ugly little squab chicks, making such a to-do about the business that the whole air is filled with their chattering, clanging, and screaming. They are indeed very disagreeable neighbours, for besides the horrid din they are ceaselessly making, they are the most untidy, not to say filthy, of housekeepers. After they have occupied their bird barracks, as their nesting places might appropriately be called, for a few weeks, the odor the wind bears from that direction could never be mistaken for one of those spicy breezes which are reputed to blow soft or Ceylon's Isle. Then they have not the redeeming quality of being fit to eat. For unless one were on the very edge of starvation, one taste of their flesh, rank with suggestions of fish and train oil, would be sufficient to banish all appetite. They have one or two good qualities. They are brave, for at the peril of their lives they will dauntlessly attack any rash intruder upon their domains, swooping down upon him with sharp cries and still sharper beaks. Their movements illustrate the poetry of motion, as they come sailing grandly in from the ocean spaces, and circle about their own particular hillock in glorious dips and curves and mountings upward, that fill the human observer with longing and envy. Much more satisfactory, however, are the black duck, sheldrake, plover, curlew, and snipe, which nest by uncounted thousands in the dense grass that girts the freshwater ponds, and afford dainty dishes for the table. It is easy to work to make a fine bag on a favorable day, and grand sport may be had by any one who knows how to handle a double barrel. Many are the interesting stories connected with bird life on Sable Island, but a single one, and that the oddest of them all, must suffice. I give it upon the unimpeachable authority of Dr. J. Bernard Gilpin. About 40 years or more ago a lot of rabbits were sent there as an experiment. The idea was, if they prospered, to furnish the human inhabitants of the island with a pleasant variety from the salt junk which generally adorned their tables. The experiment succeeded admirably. Bunny found the firm, dry sands just the thing for his burrows, while the abundant wild pea and other herbage furnished unstinted food for his prolific brood. But one fateful day in spring, a dark day in the annals of rabbitdom, a big snowy owl, that had somehow lost his bearings and been driven out to sea by a westerly gale, dropped wearily upon the island to rest his tired pinions. While sitting on a sand heap, thankful at his escape from a watery grave, he looked about him, and to his amazed delight beheld, of all sights, the most welcome in the world to a hungry owl, rabbits! Rabbits young and rabbits old, rabbits plump and rabbits lean, rabbits in sixes and rabbits in sevens, were frisking about in the long grass and over the sand, merrily innocent of their peril. At first Sir Owl could scarcely believe his eyes, for it was a bright, sunny day, and owls cannot see very well when the sun is shining. But presently, as he still squatted on the sand, perfectly motionless except his eyelids blinking solemnly, a thoughtless little rabbit, which had grown too much excited over a game of chase with his brother to look where he was going, ran up against the bewildered bird. This awoke the owl thoroughly. With a quick spring that sent all the other little cottontails scampering off to their burrows in wild affright, he fastened his long claws in the back of his unfortunate disturber, and, without even stopping to say grace, made a dinner off him on the spot. That was a red-letter day in the owl's calendar. Thenceforth he revelled in rabbit for breakfast, dinner, and supper, and, had he been a very greedy owl, might have kept his discovery of a rabbit bonanza all to himself, but he didn't. With a splendid unselfishness which some bipeds without feathers might advantageously imitate, he had no sooner recruited his strength than off he posted to the mainland to spread the good news. 4 days later he came back, but not alone this time. Bearing him company were his brothers, his sisters, his cousins, his uncles, and his aunts, in such numbers that ere the summer ended there was not a solitary bunny left upon the island. Since then the place has been restocked, and there having been no return of the owls, the rabbits, despite the fact that great numbers of them are killed for food, have so multiplied as to become a positive nuisance, and the experience of Australia being in view, the advisability of their extermination is seriously considered. Besides the rabbits, there have been, at different times, the following animals upon Sable Island, namely, the black fox, white bear, walrus, and seals, wild horses, cattle, and swine, rats, cats, and dogs. That makes quite a long list. Of course so small and bare an island could never have held them all at once. Now they are all gone except the rabbits, the horses, of which several hundreds still scamper wild over the sand dunes, and the seals, which come every year to introduce their shiny little whelps into the world, and to grow fat on the fish hurled continually upon the beach by the tireless breakers. It is a great many years since the black fox, white bear, and walrus were last seen upon the island. Too much money could be made out of them when dead for the fishermen, who knew of their presence, to let them live long. And so with powder and shot and steel they were ruthlessly exterminated. The beautiful skins of the black fox, worth 100 golden crowns each, went principally to France, where they were made up into splendid robes for royalty. Just how the wild horses and cattle found their way to Sable Island is not positively known. They were first heard of in those early days when ships loaded with cattle, grain, and farming utensils were coming over in little fleets from Europe to help to settle America. In all likelihood some of these vessels got cast away on the island, for it has ever been a dreadful place for wrecks, and in some way the animals managed to scramble safe ashore, and thus the place became populated. The wild cattle disappeared early in the century, but the horses, or rather ponies, are still there, and very interesting creatures they are. Winter and summer they are out on the sand in all weathers. Indeed, they scorn to go under cover even in the wildest storms, and although shelters have been built for them, they will not deign to enter them. Another curious thing about them is that they are never seen to lie down, and apparently go to sleep standing. There are now about 400 of these ponies, divided into troops, each under the charge and control of an old stallion, whose shaggy, unkempt mane and tail sweep the ground as he stands sentinel over his numerous family. They belong to the Dominion government, and it has been usual to cull out some 40 or 50 of the best of them each year and send them up to Halifax, where they command good prices. They are stanch, sturdy little animals, and very serviceable when properly broken. In my boyhood days I rejoiced in the possession of a fine bay that, barring a provoking habit of pitching an unwary rider over his head, was a great source of enjoyment. The manner of catching the ponies is for a number of mounted men to surround a band and drive it into a corral in which a tame pony has been placed as a decoy. This is often a very exciting experience. The cracking of whips, shouting of men, neighing of ponies, combine with the plunging of the frightened captives and the gallant charges of the enraged stallions to make up a scene not readily forgotten. Once safely corralled, the best males are picked out and lassoed, and the rest turned loose to breathe the salt air of freedom once more. As the breed has been observed to be degenerating greatly of late years, means have been taken to improve it, and it is probable that ere long Sable Island ponies will be more desirable than ever. A very amusing thing in connection with animal life on Sable Island is the story of the rats, cats, and dogs. First of all were the rats, who are reputed to be very clever about deserting sinking ships, and who here found plenty of opportunity to show their cleverness, for wrecks are always happening. They thus became so plentiful that they threatened to eat the human inhabitants out of house and home. Indeed, they did make them do without bread for 3 whole months upon one occasion. This state of things, of course, could not be tolerated. A large number of cats were accordingly imported, and they soon cleared the premises of the rapacious rodents. But it was not long ere the pussies in their turn grew so numerous, wild, and fierce as to become a source of serious trouble. A small army of dogs was therefore brought upon the scene, and they made short work of the cats, thus rounding out a very curious cycle. Did space permit, I could tell something about the seals, and their very quaint and attractive ways and manners. But perhaps enough has been already written to convince readers that however lonely, barren, and insignificant Sable Island may seem, it has an interesting story of its own which is well worth the telling. End of section 31.
Section 32 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Scott, Cheltenham, England. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald OXLEY. The Boar of Minas Basin. Upon the side of one of the rounded hills that rise up gently from the wonderful sea of verdure which Longfellow, without ever looking upon it for himself, immortalized in his Evangeline, Acacia Villa nestled cosily in the midst of many trees. Long lines of poplars stood sentinel-like up and down the house front, and marked out the garden boundaries, furnishing abundant supplies of peppers for the boys in springtime. And, better still, a whole regiment of apple and pear trees marshalled itself at the back, filling the hearts and mouths of both young and old with delight in the autumn, when the boughs bent so temptingly beneath their burden of fruitage. There could hardly be a more attractive location for a boarding school, and seeing what comfortable quarters Mr. Thompson provided, and how thoroughly he understood the business of teaching, it was no wonder that boys came not only from all parts of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, but even from the United States, to be grounded in classics, mathematics, and literature under his direction. The last boarder left Acacia Villa long ago, but 20 years back its dormitories were filled to their utmost capacity with lads of all ages and sizes, and the whole neighborhood felt the stirring influence of 20 lively, hearty, noisy boys in their midst. For nearly 10 months out of the year the school was like a hive of bees in honey time, the term beginning in September and finishing in June. It was coming on toward midsummer now, and excitement ran high throughout the school, for while the drones were looking forward longingly to the holidays, which would release them from all horrid lesson learning for a couple of months, the workers were even more eagerly expecting the final examinations, when books, bats, balls, knives, and other things dear to the schoolboy's heart were offered by wise Mr. Thompson to the boys who came out ahead in the different branches of study. The 2 boys strolling down toward the river this fine summer afternoon were good representatives of the 2 classes, Frank Hamilton being one of the brightest and most ambitious, as Tom Peters, or Bunty in the saucy slang of his schoolmates, was one of the dullest and least aspiring in the school. Yet, somehow or other, they had been great chums ever since they came by the same coach to the villa 2 years before. One could easily understand that lazy, good-natured Bunty should find much to admire and love in handsome, manly, clever Frank, who was indeed a born leader. But just what Frank found in Tom to make him so fond of him puzzled everybody, from Mr. Thompson down. In whatever lay the secret, the fact was clear that the boys loved each other like brothers. And the master, who delighted in classical allusions, used to greet them as Damon and Pythias when he encountered them together. They were discussing the approaching examinations, and speculating as to the prizes Mr. Thompson would offer this year. "No apples for me on that tree," said Tom, adding with rather a rueful smile, "If Mr. Thompson would only offer a prize for the most lickings and impositions, I guess I'd run the best chance for it." "Never mind, old boy," said Frank consolingly. "You weren't cut out for a scholar, that's clear. But you'll come out all right at something else, and perhaps make a bigger name than even Yankee himself, although it wouldn't do to let him hear you say so." "I'm afraid I'd have a poor sight to beat Yankee at anything," answered Tom. But say, Frank, how do you feel about giving him a go-by for the star prize? It'd break my heart if you didn't come out first." "Well, to tell the truth, Bunty, I don't feel any too cocky about it. Yankee's a tough customer to beat," replied Frank. "But hush, he's coming right behind us. Must be going down to the river, too, though it's more like him to stick in his room and grind." And as a tall, slight, dark-faced lad of about 16 went past them without exchange of greetings, the two friends stopped talking and went on in silence. Yankee was the nickname given to one of the American boys at the school. He had been thus distinguished because both in face and figure he bore some resemblance to the typical Uncle Sam, being longer, leaner, and sallower than any of his companions. He was of a quiet, reserved disposition, and had few friends. Indeed, he did not seem to desire many, but kept very much to himself, so that a lot of the boys disliked him. Yet, on the other hand, others respected, although they might not love him. For not only did he divide with Frank Hamilton, whom they all worshipped, the highest honors in scholarship, but once, when scarlet fever broke out and seized upon 6 of the smallest boys before they could escape to their homes, Yankee, or to give him his proper name, Emory Haynes, although he had never had the fever himself, stayed with Mr. Thompson through many anxious weeks, and watched night after night by the sufferers' bedsides, showing such tact and devotion as a nurse that the doctor said at least 2 of the boys would never have been saved from death had it not been for his help. Walking with a rapid, almost impatient step that was characteristic of him, Emory Haynes passed the 2 friends, all 3 directing their course towards the Gasperio River, which cuts a wide red gash through the Grand Pré before adding its turbid torrent to the tossing waters of Minas Basin. "If Yankee beats me for the star prize, it will be the biggest disappointment of my life," continued Frank. "It's not every day that a fellow can get hold of £5 in bright big gold pieces, and father has promised if I win it to chip in as much more and buy me a splendid boat." "Oh, Frank, you're sure to get it. Yankee works like a slave, to be sure, but he hasn't half as good a head on him," answered Tom confidently. "I'm not by any means certain of that, Tom. Just see how easily he gets through his mathematics. He's sure to beat me on that, and I'll have to make up for it by beating him in classics. Anyhow, it is no use worrying about it now. Let's hurry up and have a dip." So dropping the subject, the 2 boys ran off at a rate that soon brought them to the river bank. Here a lovely picture awaited them. From their feet the red banks of clay and sand stretched hundreds of yards away, for the tide was out, until they were lapped by the river, now shrunk into a narrow sluggish stream. To right and left and beyond the river the wide level marshlands, redeemed from the water by the patient toil of the Acadians, were waist-deep in verdure that swayed in long lines of light and shadow before the summer breeze. Not far off began the great dikes that sweep clear round the outer edge of the Grand Pré, the only elevation on all that vast plain, and now waving to their summits with dusty blossomed grass. Behind them the hills rose gently in fold upon fold, their broad shoulders flecked with frequent patches of golden grain or the dark foliage of the orchards, while over all rose a glorious summer sun that seemed to thrill the whole landscape with life and warmth and glory. But the boys had no eyes for all this beauty. They were far more concerned about the tide, and felt inclined to resent very warmly the fact that it should be out just when they wanted to have a swim. "What a fraud!" exclaimed Frank. "'Pon my word, I believe the old tide is twice as much out as it is in, now isn't it, Bunty?" "It is, sure as you're born," assented Tom. "There's nothing for it, I suppose, but to wait," and so saying, he threw himself down in the long grass, his friend immediately following his example. 20 yards away, Emory Haynes was already seated with his face turned riverward, apparently lost in deep thought. "Wonder what Yankee's thinking about," remarked Tom. "Puzzling out some of those confounded problems he does so easily, perhaps," he added feelingly, for he had had some humiliating experiences of his own inability to get over the Pons Asinorum safely, or to explain why A was equal to X under certain perplexing circumstances. "More probably planning what he'll do with that £5, said Frank half petulantly. "I guess it's more likely to go into books than into a boat if he gets hold of it." "But he isn't going to get hold of it," objected Tom, and then, without giving Frank a chance to reply, he burst out, "Oh, I say, Frank, suppose instead of waiting here we go down to meet the boar and have a race back with it?" Frank hesitated a moment before answering, for what Tom proposed was a very rash thing to do. What is known as the bore is the big wave produced by the onrush of water in a place where the tides rise 40, 50, or even 60 feet according to the time of year. The Bay of Fundy, of which Minas Basin is a branch, is famous for these wonderful tides, and the movements of the water make a sight well worth watching. The two boys had often looked on with lively interest as the returning flood rushed eagerly up the channel and over the flats, until in an incredibly short time what had been a waste of red mud was transformed into a broad expanse of turbid water. "Rather a risky business, Tom, but I don't mind trying it. I'm in the humor for almost anything today. So come along." And without more ado, the boys doffed their boots and stockings, rolled up their trousers, and set out for the water's edge. Emory Haynes watched them in silence until they had gone about 50 yards. Then, as if divining their foolish design, he called after them, "Frank, Tom, where are you going to?" "Going to meet the boar. Don't you want to come?" Frank shouted back. "Come along, Yankee, if you're not afraid," he added in a half-scornful tone. Not the words, but the tone in which they were uttered brought an angry flush out on Emory's sallow cheeks, and without stopping to think of the folly of the thing, he too flung off his boots and started after the others. "Blest if Yankee isn't coming after all," said Tom under his breath to Frank. "The chap's got plenty of grit in him." Side by side, but in silence, for somehow or other they felt ill at ease, the three boys picked their way carefully over the slippery mud and soft sand, keeping a sharp lookout for the sinkholes or quicksands in which they might easily sink to their waists or even deeper at one plunge. Hardly had they reached the edge of the channel when Frank, who had been gazing down intently toward the basin, called out, "There it comes, fellows! Doesn't it look grand?" A good way off still, but drawing nearer with astonishing speed, a wall of dark foam-topped water came rushing up the channel and over the thirsty flats. It was several feet in height, and behind it followed the whole vast volume of the tide. The three lads had never been so close to the bore before, and they stood still and silent, watching the grand sight until a shout from Emory broke the spell. "Now then, boys, let's run for it!" As fast as their feet could carry them, they sped over the treacherous greasy flats, leaping the gaping gullies, turning aside from the suspicious spots, and steering straight for the place where they had left their shoes. Frank and Tom were both famous runners and soon outstripped Emory. In fact, they were more than halfway to the bank when a sharp cry of alarm made them stop and turn to see what was the matter. One glance was enough to tell them. 20 yards behind they saw their companion embedded nearly to the waist in a quicksand from which he was madly struggling to extricate himself, while his efforts seemed only to sink him the deeper. His situation was one of extreme peril. The boar had somewhat spent its force, but still advanced steadily. Unless Emory was rescued without delay, he would be buried beneath its pitiless flood. For one brief instant Frank hesitated, and Tom, as usual, waited for him to lead. Thoughts of the personal risk, the small chance of succeeding, and even, though ever after the mere recollection of it made his cheek burn with shame, of the advantage it would be to have his rival out of the way, throbbed through his brain. But it was only for an instant, and then with a shout of, "Keep cool, Yankee, we're coming," he grasped Tom's arm, and together they sprang to the rescue. Running with all their might, they reached their imperiled schoolmate just a second before the boar did, and standing on either side of the treacherous spot, were able to each seize a hand, and with one tremendous effort draw him out of its deadly embrace ere the great wave came sweeping down upon them, tumbling them over like ninepins into the midst of its muddy surges. Fortunately, however, all three were good swimmers, and they had only to allow the water to work its will with them, for after a little tossing about it landed them safely on a sandbank, whence they could easily wade ashore. Emory did not say much to his rescuers. It was not his way. But no one could mistake the depth of feeling expressed in the few words, "Frank, you've saved my life, and I'll never forget it." 2 weeks later, the examinations came off, and amid the applause of the school, Frank Hamilton was declared winner of the Star Prize, Emory Haynes being only just a few points behind him. Mr. Thompson was very well pleased at the result, but there was one thing that puzzled him a good deal. Emery, who was by far the best mathematical scholar in the school, had somehow or other done by no means so well in that branch as usual. In fact, he had actually left several not over-difficult questions altogether unanswered, and this more than anything else had lost him the prize. Mr. Thompson mentioned the matter to Frank Hamilton, at the same time expressing his surprise. "I'm not surprised," said Frank, as something that looked very like tears welled up in his eyes. "When I saved Yankee's life, he said he'd never forget it. That's how he kept his word." Mr. Thompson needed no further explanation. End of section 32.
Section 33 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald OXLEY. Section 33. The Game of Rink Hockey. The part performed by Canada in making contributions to the list of the world's amusements has been by no means slight. Lacrosse and canoeing for the warm bright days of summer, snowshoeing and tobogganing for the crisp, cold nights of winter. These make up a quartet of healthy, hardy sports, the superiors of which, in their appropriate season, any other country might safely be challenged to show. But apparently this ambitious colony is not content with the laurels already won, and in the bringing of the game of rink hockey to perfection would add another to her garland. For this fine game, as played in the Canadian cities today, is, without question, a distinctly home product. Not that hockey is native to the soil in the same sense as lacrosse. In a simpler form, and under different names, it has long existed in England, but the difference between the game as played there on the green and played in Canada on the ice is as great as that between an old-fashioned game of rounders and a professional game of baseball. The most ancient account of hockey is to be found in that dear, delightful old book, Strutt's Sports and Pastimes of the People of England, where it figures under the name of bandy ball, what is now called the hockey stick being then known as the bandy, and there is attached to the description a comical little woodcut representing two boys in short frocks, each wielding bandies almost as big as themselves, playing with a ball half the size of their heads. As first played in Canada, hockey went by various names, some of which were apparently merely local: hurley, shiny, rickets, and so forth. It was played only upon the ice in winter time, and there was not much pretence to rules, each player taking part as best he knew how. No effort toward systematizing the game appears to have been made until the year 1875, when the members of the Montreal Football Club, in search of some lively athletic amusement for the long winter months, recognized in hockey the very thing they wanted. At first the rules adopted for the regulation of the game were modeled upon those of the English Hockey Association, but as the game developed, many changes were found necessary in adapting it to the requirements of a rink, and the rules now used by the Amateur Hockey Association of Canada are in the main original with it. Starting from Montreal, the game has made its way to Halifax and St. John on the east, and to Ottawa and Toronto on the west, and from the enthusiasm with which it has been taken up at these cities, it actually threatens to displace tobogganing and snowshoeing in the affections of the young men. Let me now try to give my readers some idea of the game and the way in which it is played. Please picture to yourselves a skating rink with an ice surface 150 feet in length by 75 feet in width. At either end, close to the platform, are the goals, consisting of two slender poles placed 6 feet apart and standing 4 feet high, with small red flags at their peaks. Such is the field of battle, and upon it the players take their places. They are dressed much as they would be for football, except that their feet are shod with skates of a peculiar make, the heel projecting more than in an ordinary skate, in order to guard against getting a nasty fall when heeling up suddenly. Each player is armed with a hockey stick, as to the size of which the only rule is that it shall not be more than 3 inches wide at any part. A good stick should be made of a single piece of ash, bent, not sawed, into the proper curve, of the length and weight the player finds to suit him best. The bone of contention between the contending sides is called the puck, and is a circular piece of vulcanized rubber 1 inch thick all through, and 3 inches in diameter. It is slightly elastic, and will rebound from the board sides of the rink if sent violently against them, a fact which enables an expert player to evade an opponent charging down to wrest it from him, as by striking the puck against the boards, and picking it up again on the rebound. He can keep on his way unchecked. The teams are arranged in the following manner. Goalkeeper takes his place between the posts, and a little forward of them. Point stands about 4 yards out, and a little to one side, so as not to interfere with the goalkeeper's view down the center. Cover point's position is from 10 to 15 yards out from goal, and on the opposite side to point. Center's post is indicated by his name, and the same may be said of the right and left forwards, and the halfback, who supports center. For the control of the game there are a referee, who follows it about as does the referee at football, and 2 umpires, 1 at either goal, the sole business of the latter being to decide whether or not the puck has passed between the posts, and not above the flags. Play begins with a bully, that is, the puck is placed between the 2 centers in the center of the rink, and they, after solemnly striking their sticks together 3 times, scramble for its possession, trying either to drive it ahead into their opponent's territory, or behind to the halfback, who immediately passes it to one of the forwards. Then the game goes on in lively earnest, and when the teams are expert and well matched, there is nothing on ice to compare with it for brilliancy and excitement. The exceeding swiftness of the players' movements, the sudden variations in the position of the puck as, under the impulse of sinewy arms, it darts from end to end, from side to side, of the rink, the incessant grind and clatter and ring of the skates, the crack of the hockeys, and the shouts of the eager players, all combine to work up the deepest interest among the spectators, and the announcement of a match between 2 good teams always ensures a large and enthusiastic attendance. The rules by which the game is governed are easily understood. So long as the puck is on the ice it is in play, even though it may be behind the goal line. Of course a goal can be won only from the front, but an opponent who is not offside may follow the puck behind the goal line, and fight for the privilege of bringing it out again. The rules as to onside and offside are precisely the same as in rugby football. That is to say, a player must always be between his own goal and the puck when he plays on it. A violation of this rule calls for a bully at the spot where the wrong stroke was made. The referee is the sole judge in all matters of this kind, and from his decision there is no appeal. The puck may be stopped, but not carried or knocked on by any part of the body. In striking it the stick must not be raised above the shoulder. The object of this rule is to check violence, and the effect of it is to make the stroke move of a push than a blow, ensuring greater accuracy in shooting for goal or a fellow player, and adding greatly to the grace of the game. A practiced player will, with wonderfully little manifest effort, send the puck from end to end of the rink if the ice is at all in good condition. Another mode of propelling the puck, which is at present permissible, but is in danger of being ruled out, is lifting. I cannot very well explain in words how it is done, but by a deft turn of the wrist, gained only by diligent practice, the rubber is made to spring into the air and fly in the desired direction. It is very effective but dangerous way of gaining ground, the danger consisting in the liability of players to be struck by the weighty missile, and ugly blows have often been received in this way. A lift at the goals is very hard to stop, if sent in low and swift, as I know by personal experience. For once, when tending goal, the point of my opponent's charge down the length of the rink, and, without slackening speed, lifted the puck, and sent it past me like a bullet, while I was making ready to receive it on the ice, not imagining that it could lift successfully while at full speed. No charging from behind, tripping, collaring, kicking, or shining is allowed, and if any player offends after 2 warnings, it is the duty of the referee to order him off the ice for the remainder of the match. If the puck goes off the ice behind the goals, it must be taken 5 yards out, at right angles from the goal line, and there faced as at the beginning of the game. When it goes off the ice at the sides, it must be faced 5 yards at right angles from the side boundary. The goalkeeper must not during play lie, kneel, or sit upon the ice, but must maintain a standing position. He may stop the puck with his hands or feet, but may not throw or kick it away from the goal. He must play it properly with his stick. 2 half hours, with an intermission of 10 minutes to regain breath and wipe off the perspiration, is the time allowed for a match, the team winning the most goals being the victors. There are no other points than goals to be scored. Such are the principal rules. And now for a few words in conclusion of a general character. Only those who are in good condition and at home on their skates should undertake to play hockey. It is a violent game, and tests both wind and muscle to the utmost. The player must make up his mind to many falls, and no lack of hard knocks on shins and knuckles. For such things will happen, however faithfully the contestants try to keep to the rules. At the same time, these very characteristics make hockey one of the manliest of sports. Strength, speed, endurance, self-control, shrewdness are the necessary qualities of one who would excel in it. Combination play is just as effective in it as in football, and there is no practical limit to the skill that may be attained. A very important feature of hockey is that it may be played at night. Since the introduction of the electric light, our rinks are made as bright as day, and then the many hard-working young men who are too busy all day to take part in any sport have the opportunity of an hour's splendid exercise after their work is over. Take it all in all, there is perhaps no winter sport exclusively for men that is destined to become more popular, or have more enduring favor. In Canada, new associations are rapidly springing up, and local leagues that arrange a schedule of matches for the season. The boys are taking hold of the game with great zest, closely imitating the tricks and artifices of their big brothers, and it is safe to say that hockey has definitely taken its place among the national sports of Canada. End of section 33. Section 34 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald OXLEY. Section 34. On the Edge of the Rapids. Hurrah, Lon! We've got the sort of day we've been looking for at last, cried Alec Pearson, as he met his chum one lovely still summer morning. No trouble about getting over to Deschenes today. Right you are, Alec. This is just the correct thing. We'll start straight after breakfast, hey? As soon as you like, provided Mother's got the grub ready. Can't think of going without that, you know. No, sir. A basket of grub's half the fun, and Mother's promised me a big one. Ditto mine, responded Alec, so there's no fear of our starving for a while, even if we get cast away on one of the islands. Cast away on one of the islands? Echoed Lon. That's a great idea. Wouldn't it make a great sensation? Perhaps it would, replied Alec, who was of a more cautious and unimaginative cast of character. But I'm not hankering to try it all the same. To get over to Deschenes will be enough fun for me. The speakers were 2 boys of about 16 years of age, sitting upon the front steps of a summer cottage, and looking out across the splendid stretch of water that flashed like a flawless mirror beneath the fiery morning sunshine. They had come out to Britannia for the summer, and were enjoying its fine facilities for boating, bathing, and canoeing, as only city boys, pent up in those close quarters for 3/4 of the year, can enjoy such exhilarating sports. The great lake, Deschenes, filled them with profound admiration. They exulted in its magnificent breadth, its mighty length, its cool, limpid depths, and most of all the glorious rapids which marked the place where it gathered itself together to become the river Ottawa again, and resume its steady course seaward. Nearly all their time they spent upon the water or in it, and in the course of a month had become tolerably expert canoeists, so that they did not hesitate to take long trips up the lake or across to the farther side. The visit to Deschenes village, whose cottages were scattered along the lake shore almost opposite to Britannia, had been put off until they felt themselves to be thoroughly masters of their cranky craft, for in order to get there it was necessary to cross the head of the rapids, and to do this successfully would require both strength and skill. For a week past Alec and Lon had felt themselves to be equal to the task, but had been delayed by unfavourable weather. Great, then, was their delight when this particular Saturday morning dawned clear and calm, promising to be the very kind of a day they desired. They started at 9 o'clock, taking with them for company, besides their well-filled baskets, Wad, Alec's handsome hunting spaniel, who had learned to behave perfectly on board the canoe. Their craft was one of the most approved make, of which they were joint owners, completely equipped with paddles, cushions, sails, and steering gear. There being not a breath of wind, they had no use for the sail, so the mast was not put up nor the rudder shipped. In this enthusiastic eagerness to realize their long-cherished plan, Lon set to paddling with all his might, but Alec, who had the stern, laughingly checked his ardor, saying, "Take it easy, Lon, take it easy, my boy. There's lots of work ahead of you. Better not waste your muscle now." Alec had taken care to make inquiries of some of the Britannia folk as to the course he should steer, and they had all impressed upon him to go a good way straight up the lake, and away from the rapids, before turning toward Deschenes, as the current was tremendously strong, and made itself felt far higher up than one would imagine, looking at it from the Britannia side. Accordingly he pointed the canoe almost due north, as though he had Aylmer in mind rather than Deschenes, and kept her on that course until Lon began to grow impatient. "What's the use of going up so far?" he protested. "You can't feel the current here." "Because old Lark told me to make that point before striking across, and he knows all about it," replied Alec. "Ugh, Lark's an old fuss. He goes away up there only because he's too lazy to pull straight across where the current's strong," grumbled Lon, who had a passion for short cuts, and who kept urging his companion to head the canoe more directly toward their destination, until at last Alec, for very peace's sake, and against his better judgment, altered their course in compliance with his wishes. For 100 yards or so the paddling was no harder than before, and they made no leeway, so that Lon could exclaim triumphantly, "There now, didn't I tell you? It's only a waste of time going so far up." But when another 100 yards' advance had brought the canoe fairly into the middle of the mighty stream, moving with majestic flow toward the angry rapids, the paddlers soon awoke to the fact that while they were still making good headway, they were making considerable leeway also, and that the task of getting across was going to be made much harder thereby. Although both noticed this, neither made any remark about it at first. Alec because he did not wish to alarm Lon, and Lon because he shrank from admitting that he would have been wiser to follow shrewd old Lark's advice. So they paddled away in silence, putting plenty of muscle into their strokes, and anxiously measuring their progress by landmarks on the farther shore. Presently their exertions began to toll upon their young frames. The perspiration beaded their faces, their breath came short, their backs began aching, and their arms grew weary. Lon's heart was already sinking within him, and Alec deeply regretted having yielded to his companion's ill-advised solicitations to disregard old Lark. But there was no time for reconsideration or exchanging of regrets. They were beyond a doubt in the grasp of the current, and must strain every nerve to extricate themselves. Then, to add to their anxiety, the weather showed signs of betraying the fair promise of the morning. Clouds began to obscure the deep blue of the sky, and a breeze to ruffle the calm surface of the lake. Unable to control his feelings any longer, Lon broke out with more than a hint of a sob in his voice. "Oh, Alec, I wish we hadn't started. I'm getting awfully tired, and we don't seem to be making any headway at all." "Oh, yes we are, Lon," responded Alec, doing his best to be cheerful. "Paddle away, we'll get across all right." Thus encouraged, Lon put a little more life into his strokes for the next few minutes, and the canoe did seem to be gaining ground, but the gain was only temporary. The further they advanced the more they felt the force of the current. Yet it was too late to turn back. Their only course was to keep on until they had shaken themselves free from the power that was dragging them downward to destruction. Whether they would have been equal to this feat can only be guessed, for in trying to change his position to relieve his cramped legs, Lon lost his balance for a moment, and on attempting to recover himself, did what was even worse, let slip his paddle, which was instantly whirled out of his reach. "Oh, Alec, what shall we do now?" he cried in dismay. Alec's face was white and set. "Nothing. We are powerless," he said quietly. It was, of course, futile for him to try to contend alone with the pitiless current. This little canoe, as if glad at having no longer to fight its way foot by foot, glided gaily down towards the rapids, and all that Alec could do was to keep it straight in its course, and not allow it to swing around broadside. Poor Lon, utterly overcome with terror, crouched down in the bow, sobbing so that he shook the frail canoe. But Alec was not one to yield to despair so long as anything could be done. His brain was busy seeking some scheme for escape from their exceeding peril, and as he glanced anxiously ahead, a thought flashed into his mind that caused his eye to brighten and his pale face to light up with hope and determination. Right on the edge of the rapids, just before the smooth, swift stream broke up into tumultuous billows, stood a little island, a mere patch of rocks, crowned with half a dozen straggling trees. If he could only beach the canoe on this island they might yet be saved. It was all that remained between them and certain death. The island was not more than 200 yards distant, and to reach it he must make the canoe cut obliquely through the current. Summoning all his energies for a supreme effort, he bent to his task, in the meantime saying to Lon, "Be ready to jump the moment the canoe strikes." For a boy of his age, Alec put a wonderful degree of strength into his strokes, and he had the joy of seeing his frail craft obey, in spite of the opposing waters, until it was pointing fair for the island. Then with a glad hurrah he ceased fighting the current, and joined forces with it, so successfully as to drive the canoe straight towards the rocks. He did not miss his aim. With a leap, as though it were alive, the canoe rushed at the island and ran half its length out of the water, a sound of splintering wood telling that its bottom had suffered in so doing. With feelings of indescribable relief the boys sprang out upon the solid ground, and instantly embracing one another, danced about in sheer exuberance of joy. The rapids were cheated of their prey, and the worst of the peril was past. Having thus given vent to their feelings, they proceeded to examine the canoe, and were glad to find that its bottom was not very badly injured, and could be easily repaired. Their next thought was, how could they get off the island? They were safe enough there for the present, of course, and they had sufficient provisions, if carefully husbanded, to keep them from starving for 3 or 4 days. But they had no idea of playing the part of Robinson Crusoe and his man Friday, even for that short space of time, if it could possibly be helped. So they got on the edge of the island nearest Britannia, and Alec held up his paddle with his coat on it as a signal of distress, while both shouted at the top of their voices. Their shouts were drowned in the ceaseless roar of the rapids, but after a while their signal of distress was observed, and soon a crowd had gathered on the shore opposite them, and there was great excitement. Everybody was eager to help, but nobody knew just what to do. All sorts of schemes were suggested for the rescue of the boys, the most feasible of which was to have a large boat go out above the rapids and anchor there, and then send down a smaller one secured by a rope, with which it could be hauled back again, for no boat could by any possibility be rowed back against that mighty current. But there were 2 difficulties in the way of this plan. There was no boat at the village big enough and no rope long enough for the purpose, so some other way must needs be devised. The morning wore away and the afternoon shadows lengthened without anything being done, and it looked as though the boys would have to stay on the island all night, when the cry was raised that there was a raft coming down, and sure enough the great towing steamer, followed by a huge raft of square timber, hove into sight far up the lake. The problem of the boys' deliverance need no longer he worried over. The raftsmen would solve it in short measure. The big raft reached Britannia just long enough before dark to allow of the rescue being accomplished. The moment the foreman heard of the boys' situation, he detailed 6 of his best men, 3 being Indians and 3 French Canadians, to bring them off. Landing their largest bun, a kind of boat peculiar to lumbering, being flat on the bottom and very high at both bow and stern, they rowed off briskly towards the rapids, laughing and chaffing one another, and evidently deeming it quite a bit of fun, while the crowd gathered on the shore watched their every movement with breathless attention. Managing their clumsy-looking but most seaworthy craft with perfect skill, they made an easy landing on the island, took the boys on board, and then waving their hats to the admiring onlookers, continued gaily on into the very midst of the boiling rapids, the big bun bobbing about like a cork, seemingly at the entire mercy of the waters, yet all the time being cleverly steered by her crew, and after an exciting passage, during which the boys hardly breathed, shooting out into the smooth stretch below the rapids without having taken so much as a single drop of water on board. A hearty cheer broke from the delighted spectators at this happy conclusion to the affair, and a few moments later the boys were in their midst, receiving the embraces of their overjoyed parents and the vigorous congratulations of the others. The rescuing raftsmen were well rewarded for their timely service, and Master Lon learned a lesson in caution that he is not likely soon to forget. End of section 34. Section 35 of My Strange Rescue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald OXLEY. Section 35. Theo's Tobogganing Triumph. The boys of Bridgetown were all agreed that there had not been such a winter for tobogganing since they could remember, and if they ever thought of the weather clerk at all, it was with feelings of the deepest gratitude. In the first place, it began with a frost that made the ground as hard as iron, and the waters were, in Bible language, hid as with a stone. Then upon this came one fall of snow after the other, until there was nothing left to wish for in that direction, and the Hoys were thoroughly content. Not only was the weather clerk thus considerate, but nature had already been kind enough to provide them with the finest site for a toboggan slide imaginable. The placid stream, which bore the name of Bass River, spread out into a broad reach just before it came to their town, and on one side the bank rose up into a steep bluff, whose grass-grown face, slanting right down to the water's edge without a break or gully, seemed intended for no other purpose than to afford the boys a splendid coasting ground when well sheeted with snow, and the boys knew right well how to appreciate their privileges, I can assure you. To go out to Bass River Bluff on a Saturday afternoon was to witness a scene well worth seeing. The hill would fairly swarm with boys and girls enjoying themselves to the top of their bent, from Patsy Cahill, the washerwoman's ragged urchin, with his curious apology for a sled constructed out of old barrel staves, on which he dared to take only short slides from a little way up the hill, and which he sorely regretted was not big enough to carry him and Katy at the same time, to Ralph Masterson, the eldest son of the rich and haughty judge, with his big toboggan, so finely varnished and comfortably cushioned, that could take 4 persons down every trip. The young people of the town would turn out and make the valley ring with their laughter and shouting. One of the most regular attendants at Bass River Bluff was Theo Ross, who, with his widowed mother, lived in a cozy cottage on the opposite side of the river from the town, and consequently was looked upon as one of the country boys, although he came in every day to the high school. There was a good deal of rivalry between the boys of Bridgetown and those who lived in the scattered settlement across the river, which was known as Riverside. a rivalry that led to all sorts of matches, and now and then to fights. No one took more hearty interest in this rivalry than Theo. He was a strong, stout, hearty lad of 16, up to anything, as the saying is, and was generally looked upon by the Riverside boys as their leader. One Saturday evening he came home in high spirits. "Hoop-de-dee-doo-din-do," he shouted, as he burst into the house. "Why, Theo, what are you so excited about?" inquired his mother, looking up with a glad smile of welcome for the boy that was the joy and pride of her life. "Excited? Perhaps I am. And no wonder, for aren't we going to have the biggest tobogganing match next Saturday afternoon that you ever heard of?" replied Theo, at the same time giving his mother a hug and a kiss that were a credit to both, for it showed how thoroughly they understood one another. Mrs. Ross was a wise not less than a loving mother, and one of the proofs of her wisdom was the hearty interest she took in her son's sports as well as in his studies. He had lost his father when but a baby, and she had determined to fill the vacant place to the best of her ability. So from the very first she entered heartily into his amusements, and made herself his companion as far as she could. Theo never played cricket or lacrosse so well as when his mother was looking on, and no applause was sweeter to him than the clapping of her hands. He therefore felt sure of an attentive listener as he proceeded to unfold the cause of his excitement. "Well, you know, mother, the Bridgetown boys have been boasting all winter about their toboggans, and saying that they can run away from anything in Riverside, and our fellows have been talking back at them, until both sides have begun to feel pretty hot over it. We've had a lot of races, but they didn't settle anything, because sometimes the Bridgetown boys would win, and sometimes the Riverside. So this afternoon I proposed to Ralph Masterson that next Saturday afternoon he should bring a team of 4 tobogganers from the town, and I would bring 4 from the country, and we'd settle the question without any more talk." "Well, but, Theo dear, won't it be dangerous for so many as 8 to coast down together? You might run into each other," asked Mrs. Ross rather anxiously. "Oh, you dear innocent," laughed Theo. "That's not the way we'll do at all. Only 2 will go down at a time. You see there will be, first of all, 4 heats, and we'll draw lots for our places in the heats. Then the 4 winners will run against each other, making 2 more heats, and then there will be a final heat in which the 2 winners will run together, and that will decide." "That seems a very good arrangement," said Mrs. Ross approvingly. "Whose idea was it?" "Mostly mine, mother. It's the best way to get fair play all around," answered Theo. "Will you have any difficulty in choosing your team?" "Oh, not much. Walt Powell and Rob Sands will be on for sure. They have good toboggans, and they can steer splendidly. The 4th chap I'll pick out through the week." "Well, Theo, you must do your best to win, for I'll be there to watch you." "You may depend upon it, I will, for your sake as much as for the honor of Riverside," replied Theo, giving his mother a loving kiss before he went off to his room for a wash. It seemed an awfully long week to the excited boys, impatient for the coming contest. Theo had many applicants for a position on his team, and having, after careful deliberation, decided in favor of Fred Fellows, the 4 boys had many an earnest consultation as to the best way of securing success. On Friday evening the others brought their toboggans over to Mrs. Ross's, and they spent an hour or 2 in seeing that the bottoms were perfectly smooth, the gut lashings all taut, and the cushions secured beyond the possibility of slipping. They were not a little disturbed at some rumors that had reached them of Ralph Masterson having sent off to the capital and got a new toboggan of a kind just lately patented, which was made differently from the others and reported to be much faster. If this was true, Ralph had done rather a mean thing, for although not expressly stipulated, it was generally understood that the toboggans to be used in the contest were such as they already had, and not new ones imported for the purpose. But, as Theo sensibly said, it was no use worrying until they knew for certain. So, hoping for the best, they parted for the night. Saturday proved as fine as could be wished, and early in the afternoon a crowd began to gather on Bass River Bluff. Besides the honor of the championship, Judge Masterson had offered a handsome prize to the winner in the shape of a silver cup, and there was no end to the excitement. The judge himself and all his family were present. So, too, were Theo's mother and parents of the other contestants. So, too, Patsy Kehoe, holding Katy with one hand and dragging his forlorn little barrel-stave sled with the other. Everybody in Bridgetown and Riverside that could come had come, and the flat top of the bluff was fairly black with spectators. By 3 o'clock all the competitors had arrived. When Ralph Masterson appeared, Theo gave one sharp glance at his toboggan, then turned to his companions with his face the picture of indignation. "It's true, boys. After all, Ralph's got one of those new-fangled affairs I read of in the papers. They say they can go like smoke. He hasn't done the square thing. But we're not beaten yet, for all that." And Theo looked proudly down at his toboggan, which had won as high a reputation for speed as the owner had for skill. It took half an hour to draw lots for the heats, and then at last all was ready, and Judge Masterson, acting as starter, called out the first pair. Besides the steerer, each toboggan was to carry another person for ballast. Fred Fellows was the first of Theo's team to try his fortune. Amid breathless silence and suspense he put his toboggan in position beside his opponent's. "Are you ready?" asked the judge. They both nodded. "Then, go!" And with half a dozen quick steps they pushed their toboggans over the brow of the hill, and, flinging themselves on sideways, with one leg extended for a rudder, shot down the steep slope like arrows from a bow. For some time they kept side by side, then Fred was seen to swerve and slew, and the Bridgetown boy to slip ahead. The advantage was not much, but he kept it to the end, and the first heat went against Riverside. The Bridgetown boys cheered lustily, and the Riversiders looked rather glum, until the next heat was run and resulted in a win for the latter, thus making things even. The Riverside entry took the third heat also, and their hopes ran high, but cooled down again when the fourth heat went to Bridgetown. The result of the first round, accordingly, was that 2 of each side had won their heats, Theo and Ralph being, of course, among the winners. The excitement grew more and more intense as, after a little breathing space, the second round was called. Curiously enough, Theo and Ralph did not come together in this round either, having each another opponent, whom they vanquished easily. As they stood on the hill together at the conclusion of the round, Ralph turned to Theo with a smile which betokened perfect confidence in himself, and pointing to his new toboggan, said, "She's a hummer. There's nothing on the bluff to touch her." "Do you think it was just the square thing, Ralph, to get that toboggan when it was understood we were to race with what we had already?" asked Theo quietly. "Pooh!" replied Ralph, tossing his head defiantly. "Everything's fair in love and war." As he turned away and swung his toboggan round, it came in contact with Patsy Kehoe's barrel-stave sled. With a muttered oath Ralph sprang toward the obstruction, and kicking it high into the air, the clumsy little thing fell to the ground shattered into useless fragments. Poor Patsy gave a cry as he saw his plaything demolished, but Ralph's angry face silenced him again, and with tears running down their cheeks he and Katy proceeded to gather up the pieces. "Get ready for the final heat," called out Judge Masterson. Mrs. Ross pressed forward to Theo's side and whispered in his ear, "Good luck to you, my boy." With every eye upon them, Ralph and Theo drew their toboggans into position. The difference between the two toboggans was very marked. Theo's was a particularly fine one of the ordinary kind, but Ralph's was made of narrow hardwood strips secured by screws instead of thongs, and had a sharp racing look that could not be mistaken. Just as the contestants were ready to receive their ballast, Theo's glance fell upon Patsy Kehoe, pressing forward eagerly on the edge of the crowd, watching him with his whole soul in his eyes. He knew well how intensely the little fellow hoped for his success, and suddenly an idea flashed into his mind which caused him to call out to Judge Masterson, "A minute's time, please, sir." "All right, my lad," replied the judge. Then, to the surprise of everybody, Theo, after whispering to Walter Powell, whom he had first intended to be his companion on the toboggan, and who now drew aside, beckoned to Patsy Kehoe. Patsy approached bashfully. "Jump on in front, Patsy," said Theo briskly. "You're to be my ballast this time." There was a murmur of astonishment from the crowd as the ragged little chap awkwardly got into his place, and Theo did not miss the contemptuous curl of his opponent's lip, but neither did he fail to catch the pleased, approving look his mother sent him. A moment more and everything was in readiness. The spectators held their breath as the judge, lifting his right hand, asked, "Are you ready?" and then bringing it down with a crack into the other, shouted, "Then go!" As if shot from a bow, the two toboggans leaped over the bluff and went rattling down the smooth slope side by side and head to head. Down, down, they went. Theo and Ralph with iron grip and hard pressed toe, keeping them straight in their course, and Patsy and the other ballast clinging fast to the handrail. It was the proudest moment of Patsy's life, and one that he would never forget. Just as the toboggans, still perfectly even, approached the bottom of the declivity where the track ran out on to the bosom of the river, Ralph struck a slight obstacle, which caused it to swerve and then to slew. With a vicious dig of his toe he tried to bring it round straight again. In his hot haste he overdid it, and the head swung round until the toboggan went broadside to the track, scratching, bumping, cracking, until like a flash it came bang against the side of the slide, pitching its passengers out upon their heads and splitting one of the thin strips clean in two. In the meanwhile Theo and Patsy, amid the cheers of the crowd on the hill, were speeding smoothly over the ice, winners by nearly 100 yards. Great was the delight of the riverside folk at their champion's victory, and many of the Bridgetownians joined in congratulations too, for Ralph Masterson was far from popular among them. When Theo reached the top of the bluff his mother hastened to him, her face beaming with pleasure as she said, "I am very proud of your victory, Theo, but I am prouder still of the heart that prompted you to take Patsy Kehoe." End of section 35. End of My Strange Rescue by James Macdonald OXLEY.